Okay, doing something special today. I'm speaking with Next Level.
Yeah, thank you
And
for sharing.
yeah, so Next Level is somebody that had a bit of an interaction with Pastor Kevin Morgan, who I've also had on my channel. And we connected through the comment section under a couple of my videos. And he wanted to discuss the topic of amalgamation. This has been a real hot topic when it comes to the writings of Ellen White. So I'm going to give Next Level some time to present his side of the story, and I have some slides of his, and then I'm going to present some things in response to that, and then we're going to have a back and forth. So hopefully this can be a blessing to all of you who watch this. Okay, so do you want me to just pull up your slides right now?
You can pull up my slides, but before that, I would just like to say a few words before that. I would say first that if somebody hears some offensive language, I am just representing the views that I have read. This is not my view. I do not defend this. I'm just going to make my argument to show the point that I'm trying to argue. If somebody is offended, do not think that I'm offending you. Do not think that I'm using incentive language to, yeah, to make Ellen White look, how do you call it, in a bad light. That's not my intent. I'm just trying to represent the way that I interpret the quote, and I'm going to make my case for that. Also, I'm not going to argue whether the topic of de-amalgamation is a racist topic. That is not my intent. All I'm going to show is whether she made error under inspiration. That is all I care about. And now you can begin.
Okay. Uh,
Yeah, I do see my presentation. It seems well. Okay, so do I begin now? I have
uh,
20 minutes.
yeah, I'll start the timer now.
Yeah, so the topic of the amalgamation, what did Ellen White meant? Here on the first slide, you can see the original quote. These are the only two sentences. I mean, yeah, keep it here for a while. These are the only two paragraphs you can say that she wrote about this topic. She has not clarified what she meant further. I would argue that the way that this is written is the literal interpretation. This is what she meant. And here now we are going to read the statements. But if there was one sin above another, which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, it was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere. Every species of animal which God had created were preserved in the ark. The confused species which God did not create, which were the result of amalgamation, were destroyed by the flood. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen in the endless varieties of species of animals and certain races of men. I would argue that even though there are at least two interpretations that has been historically presented, only the literal, the original one, is the valid interpretation of the text, and I would argue that every other interpretation does violence to the obvious meaning of the text. I would interpret these two statements to mean this, that before the flood, people mixed with animals. She doesn't specify how, but they mixed with animals, and the product of this mixture were the so-called confused species, and those confused species were destroyed by the flood. But then she says that after the flood, the same thing happened again, and the offspring of these confused species later diversified to be certain animal races and certain races of men. The amalgamation that Ellen White is speaking about is between humans and animals. I would say that this is the most natural reading of the text. There are two ways to support my position. I'm going to go through the historical argument and I'm going to go from the contextual argument, which we're probably going to discuss later. So you can go to the next slide. So here I have presented the historical background according to which the word amalgamation, it was already used in the 19th century. It was used in various meanings That is true. You can argue that by amalgamation, you can mix different things, you can mix similar things, you can mix every type of thing. But I have pointed sources that Ellen White was familiar with, according to which the term amalgamation was already used to mix the black race and the regular white race. And I have cited the guy called Buckard Payne. This guy was an absolute racist. He wasn't an Adventist, that is important, but he was a religious figure. According to his book, this is what he says. Yeah, let me just zoom in a little bit. This is from his book. This book, by the way, was in the library of Ellen White, so she was very aware of who he was. This is what he says. The black race was created before Adam, and the Negro is a beast. After the flood at Babel, Canaan mated with the Negro, and his progeny was the result of the sin of amalgamation, and they were neither men nor beast. And this crime caused confusion. Before the flood, the sons of God took Negro wives, thus committing the crime of amalgamation, which brought the flood upon the earth. God destroyed mankind for the crime of amalgamation, or whatever that word is, of the white race with the black, mere beast of the earth. The point here is to show that they already used the word amalgamation in reference to the black people, and now you can make the argument. But he's talking about intermarriage. He's talking about the black race and the white race. The problem is that according to Buckard Payne, the black people were animals. They were species created before Adam, before the first man, and that is how the amalgamation is confusing the image of God, by mixing what is made in the image of God, which is Adam, with something that is made below the image of God, which would be the animals. So according to him, the amalgamation is physical between men and beast. But for beast, he takes the Negro race. And I am apologizing for the offensive language. Those are just the historical views. Those are not my views. I condemn what he is writing about. But I must share this in order to say that Ellen White was familiar with this language. I would even make the argument that she tried to plagiarize his view and reinterpret it through the biblical lens. And I have also shown how other authors, non-religious and religious, have already tried to argue from the evolutionist side of the, how do you call it, the scientific development, how the Negro race traces from animals. So that is the historical background in the 19th century, and that is how the word amalgamation was used. So you can safely use the meaning of amalgamation to be between people and animals, according to the historical sources. Now you can say, this guy is not an Adventist, this guy is not Ellen White. I agree. But all I'm showing here is that she was familiar with the usage of her contemporaries. And now you can, here you can see the link. Ellen White had those books in her library, and we have the citation. You can check the citations later in your own free time. Scroll to the next slide, please. So here I'm quoting B.F. Snook and William H. Brickenhoff. Those guys were Adventist elders. Those guys were ordained by James White himself. These guys were the first critics to ever raise the issue of the amalgamation to Ellen White after they read her statement. This is what they write. These visions teach that the Negro race is not human. This charge they deny, the Adventists. But we will let the reader decide for himself. Hear what she says. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of men and beasts, as may be seen in almost endless varieties of species and in certain races of men. Here they're quoting the book of Ellen White, Spiritual Gifts. But what are we to understand by certain races of men? She has not informed us in her writings, but left us to fix the stigma of amalgamation where we may see fit. But the interpretation has come to light. She told it to her husband, and he made it known to Elder Ingram, and he divulged the secret to the writer. That Sister White has seen that God never made the darky. And here they're continuing to quote the Apostle Paul. Then they say, who should we believe, Paul or Ellen White, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that these guys are the first to say that Ellen White meant the literal amalgamation of man with beast, and they claimed to have heard a rumor in their days that she directly said that God didn't make the dark people. And you can see from the original quote, it says that the confused species which were not made by God. That is the part that they're citing, which means that if the confused species are the black people, God never made them. Those are the charges of the critics. You might say they are lying. I understand that. But again, this is proof that she was aware of the charges. She was aware of how her critics, how Adventists, and how everybody of the 19th century interpreted the quote. So that is why I'm citing them. This is from the Adventist history. It's all official. You can find the reference. And now here I have made a summary of the quote. The summary is that the critics interpreted the amalgamation to be between men with beasts, the black race to be a product of the amalgamation with animals. God never made the confused species. This is the interpretation, of course, the way that they're interpreting her statement. And God never made the darky. This is the rumor that they heard. Of course, this cannot be confirmed. I understand that. But you should be aware that the critics are already giving serious charges to Ellen White. How much minutes do I have?
You could finish your whole presentation. I know it's not that
Thank you.
long,
Yeah.
but
Next
right
slide.
now
Yeah.
you've got 9 minutes. You've done 9 minutes already. But yeah, I'll let
Ooh.
you. You could finish the whole
Thank you.
thing.
Thank you. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. Thank you. So this is Uriah Smith. Uriah Smith, as most of you know, he is we can say the second most prominent Adventist in the world, maybe after Doug Batchelor, but that's another topic. So this is what Uriah Smith said. And you should know that he was the guy who made the 28 fundamental rules. So he is very well aware of Ellen White. He knows what she said, and he has given us interpretation of her words. Now, because it's a very long chapter, I will try to summarize it without reading the whole thing, but I will say this. First, when the critics wrote their accusations, Uriah tried to defend Ellen White. That's why he wrote a book. In his book, he commented on various topics, and he also made an entire chapter defining the amalgamation. So in his book, you can see the picture of the book and the guy here. He is telling us how we are to understand the amalgamation. And this is what he says. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the basic stuff. The vision teach, says the objector, that the Negro race is not human. We deny it. They do not so teach. Now, I want you to remember the previous slide. There we have made two claims. The first claim is that the Negro race is not human. That is what the critics are claiming. Uriah denies this. That is true. He denies this. He says, we don't agree. But the second claim is that the Negro race is mixed with animals. That is the part that he doesn't deny. He doesn't deny that. So he understands the amalgamation to be physical between man with beast, and later he's going to give us three examples of confused species according to him that lived in his days. Those are the wild Bushmen of Africa, some tribes of the Hottentots, and perhaps the Digger Indian. He's saying that those three represent the product of the amalgamation, which was between men with beast. Those are according to the words of Uriah Smith. This is what he said. But what has the ancient sin of amalgamation to do with any race or people at the present time, meaning that the people from the tribes? Are they in any way responsible or to be held accountable for it? Not at all. So here he is saying that those who suffer the sin of amalgamation, they are not responsible for that. So he's not speaking about a moral amalgamation. He's speaking about a physical amalgamation, something that you're born with. Those people, he even says below, everybody can read the quote for themselves to know what he's saying. He's saying that they don't have, some of them might not have enough sufficient powers of the mind. Basically, he's saying that they could be even mentally deranged because of the sin of amalgamation, that they are not responsible for that. And we are to treat them with respect because we're Christians. That's what Uriah is saying. So he's affirming a literal amalgamation, and he's saying that they are mixed with animals. There is only one disagreement that Uriah had with Ellen White on this topic. Ellen White said that God did not make the confused species. Uriah says God made them. He doesn't disagree that they are mixed with animals, But his argument is going to be that because they have the boat of Adam, the first person, therefore they still are made by God because they carry the same boat. That is going to be his argument. But he doesn't deny that they are mixed with animals. He still understands physical amalgamation. And here is the summary. And when I appeared on the Adventist Defense League, they tried to waste 10 minutes of my time trying to say that Uriah meant a different type of amalgamation, but that is probably false. And I'm going to show the sources that say that Uriah meant a physical amalgamation. But here, let me read the summary first. He tried to refute the charges of the critics that the black race is not human. He still affirms that the amalgamation is between beasts and humans, between men with beasts. He gave examples of some of the amalgamated races. He argued that their moral decline was due to the physical sin of amalgamation, for which they are not guilty. If it was moral, they would be guilty. But he's saying they're not guilty of this. And basically, if you read the whole quote, you can see how he's appealing to the evolutionist of his days who cannot say where the human and the animal begin. But again, why is Uriah important? You can say Uriah is not Ellen White. Why do we care about Uriah? Here is why, the next quote below. And I'm having a little bit trouble zooming in, and that's why sometimes I'm cutting.
Okay.
James White, yeah, it's fine, no problem. James White read Uriah Smith's book and warmly recommended it in August 25, 1868. This is from Review and Herald. The association has just published a pamphlet entitled The Visions of Mrs. E.G. White, a manifestation of the spiritual gifts. That is the book of Uriah, according to the scripture. It is written by the editor of the review. While reading the manuscript, I felt very grateful to God that our people could have disabled defense of those views they so much worth and price, which others despise and oppose. The book is designed for very wide circulation, so whoever printed the book intended this book to reach everybody. They are aware of this chapter. And this is what it says. James and Ellen White took 2,000 copies of Smith's book with them to the camp meeting that year. That means that Ellen White has read the book. She knows what the book says. She knows that according to Uriah, the statement about the amalgamation is physical. So she's sharing a book where it literally says that black people came from animals. And I would say that this is a big proof, because then you have to argue that Ellen White misled Uriah Smith, never corrected Uriah Smith. They literally copy-pasted a book 2,000 times when Ellen White never agreed to Uriah's interpretation. I would say that it's very clear from this statement that Ellen White agreed with Uriah Smith. And I would say that this is a big argument. Here I have also cited from the Spectrum magazine the official historical position on Uriah Smith, in case somebody tries to argue that Uriah is not saying this. This is what it says. Uriah Smith clearly reflected the popular idea of his time that crosses between men and animals had created a no man's land between man and beast, populated by gorillas, chimpanzees, wild bushmen of Africa, Patagonians, and Hottentots. So this idea that he is interpreting was popular. I would argue this is what Ellen White meant. That is what all the 19th century meant by the language of the amalgamation. So you can continue to next slide. Now we are going to read more contemporaries. We're going to start with a guy called George Macready Price. He wrote in April 1931. He's not a contemporary. He left way further, but you'll see the point. Issues of the ministry that he would like to make a slight alteration in Ellen White's statement, since the fact there has been an amalgamation of man and of beast, as may be seen in almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men. So basically what he is trying to do is include the preposition of in order to say that there is amalgamation that modifies the animals and amalgamation that modifies the humans individually, separately. But the problem is that D. Robinson, for many years Ellen White's personal secretary, took issue with Price. In a paper titled Amalgamation versus Evolution, he said that Price's insertion of the word of into Ellen White's statement did violence to the obvious meaning that the author herself intended. So even though George Price is supporting your position, he's supporting the Adventist Defense League position. The secretary of Ellen White says that he is doing violence to the obvious meaning of the text. And this is the secretary of Ellen White. So I would say that this is another proof that even he understood that Ellen White meant the literal mixture of man with beast. The spiritual interpretation, this modern revision that you guys are trying to do, it's absolutely impossible based on Uriah and based on the secretary so far. And now we continue. Quark caught attention to his... keep my previous slide. I was going to read.
Okay.
No problems. Yeah. So Quark caught attention to his work with Ellen White's son, Willie C. White, and D. Robinson, the same guy, her secretary. Neither of these men ever doubted that Ellen White meant the crossing of man and beast by the phrase amalgamation of man and beast. So here we learn that the secretary, the son of Ellen White, Willie White, also believed that the amalgamation is physical. They affirm this. So far, we have the entire family of Ellen White affirming a literal interpretation, as I do. And now the final quote here. Dear brother Underwood, in my boyhood, I heard her read the passage you referred to. This is the passage of the amalgamation. And I heard her and father discuss the matter. As far as I can remember, their discussion included apes, baboons, chimpanzees, and that type of larger, intelligent monkey. They also discussed the matter of some of the lowest tribes of natives in Africa as being possibly included. I do not remember that mother ever spoke with great definities regarding the statement. Now, this source is difficult to prove because it's an alleged letter of Willie White, so maybe you can disregard it, but it doesn't change my point because we know what Willie White and the secretary believed. Now you can go to the next slide. So this is a paragraph from Willie White commenting on his mother and the quote itself. This is what he says. Reading the two paragraphs, which are to be found in Spiritual Gifts and also in the Spirit of Prophecy regarding amalgamation and the reason why they were left out of the book, the question as to who took the responsibility of leaving them out, I can speak with perfect clearness and assurance. They were led by E.G. White herself. No one connected with her work had any authority over such a question, and I never heard of anyone offering to her counsel regarding this matter. In all questions of this kind, you may set it down as a certainty that Sister White was responsible for leaving out or adding to matters of this sort in the latter editions of our books. Sister White not only had good judgment based upon a clear and comprehensive understanding of conditions and of the natural consequence of publishing what she wrote, but she had many times direct instruction from the angel of the word regarding what should be omitted and what should be added in the new editions. So there are two problems here. Willie White is saying that her mother removed the quote because this quote doesn't appear in Patriarchs and Prophets. She removed the quote because an angel of the word told her so. Now that is an argument as to why I say that this whole topic is under inspiration. If the word is personally taking a position in order to remove it, he has a stance on this, and I would argue it has to be either true or false, and it's under inspiration. But the problem is, why would God inspire a prophet to write something and then tell the prophet to hide it? That doesn't make any sense. There is no biblical example of somebody doing that in the Bible. And the second problem is this. If you are correct that the amalgamation is, let's say, moral or individual only for the animals and only for the humans, that wouldn't cause a controversy. Here it says that she removed the quote because she was aware what controversy it would bring to the population. But to state the regular interpretation of the Setite view, that is not controversial. That was already established to be believed by people from the Protestant circles. So I don't see how is this controversy. It's only controversial if the quote was literal. If you say that man is mixed with animals, only then it's controversial. So there is no reason to remove the quote unless she was aware that the population would have a problem with that. Unless she interpreted to be literal. Unless that's what she meant. Next slide. Now these are more SDA sources. Basically a letter from some professor geologist Adventist who said this: "Dear Mr. De Goyler, I'm sorry that you were not in the afternoon meetings where this topic was discussed in some detail concerning the amalgamation of men with beast." He's clarifying, with beast. "I believe this was how the image of God was confused, and as Sister White points out, was the ultimate cause of the flood. It would have been impossible to ascertain whether this living form was man or beast, whereby confusing the image of God in which man was originally created. I personally believe that the evidence seen today for such amalgamation is what some science calls the ape man. Such species as the Australopithecus, whatever he mentions there, would fit into this category. Neanderthal man, on the other hand, would not be classified as an ape man, but rather a degenerate Homo sapiens. Not being sure of what you are seeking for as an answer, I trust that these few comments have met your needs." So basically, I'm citing this to say that even after Ellen White, this was a popular view. People believe this literally. So I would argue that your revisionist interpretation is the minority. It became prominent very, very late, and you cannot find your interpretation in the first 70 years after this quote was written. Next slide. So San Francisco debate in 1947. So the Adventists actually decided to debate this issue. This is an Adventist debate between Adventists. Here we have Dr. Frank Marsh and Dr. Harold Quark. Dr. Frank Marsh is the guy who supports your position. Dr. Harold Quark is the one guy who supports my position. The arguments that Dr. Marsh made basically are the same arguments that you guys are repeating, but his most, how do you call it? His basic argument is that if Ellen White meant the literal amalgamation, it would cause problems with science. And that is why, from that point onward, they began to teach that it's spiritual, because they would contradict science. So they cannot allow that Ellen White could be false. That's why they believe that she had to mean spiritual interpretation. That is the only argument that March made. And Dr. Harold Quark basically repeated the same arguments that I have just read in general about Uriah, about her son, about the quotes everywhere. Dr. Harold Quark is defending my position. He has cited all the arguments. Marsh, his only claim is that, here is what it says: if Ellen White said there has been union of men and beasts, she would set March be in conflict with all the laws of crossbreeding. That is his only argument, which is not an argument. He has a presupposition that Ellen White cannot be wrong, and that's why even to today, people try to argue that she meant spiritual amalgamation. That is his only argument. Next slide. Actually, can you return sorry, give me a minute for the previous one.
Okay.
The main argument from Marsh was that the amalgamation between animals and humans was scientifically impossible. Most of SDAs, with the support of Francis de Nichols, adopted that position and therefore began to reinterpret the amalgamation to be about separately applied to animals and humans. Okay, continue. So here is a general summary of what we have already seen. Willie White, James White, D. Robinson, her secretary, Uriah Smith, Harold Quark, and others agreed that the amalgamation is between men with beast, or physical amalgamation. This was the unanimous interpretation for almost 70 years after the quote was written. Ellen White never corrected anybody publicly or privately, and she was well aware of how everybody understood her statements. She openly promoted the pioneer's view when she sold Uriah Smith's book and so on. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and with this we have exhausted the historical case. Now I'm basically going to argue from the quote itself. And here is the second part of the quote, because that is the most relevant part of the quote. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of men and beasts, as may be seen in the endless varieties of species of animals and certain races of men. Now, my interpretation is this: men with animals, which equals the confused species, which later evolved to some animal species and certain races of men. That is the most natural reading of the text. Another argument is this, that Ellen White already used the word intermarriage to describe the mixing of different races. She did that for Genesis 6. So she already described what spiritual amalgamation would look like. She calls it intermarriage between the races. But she already described that, which means that in the next paragraph, when she's mentioning amalgamation, she must mean a completely different event. What Kevin Morgan, what ADL, what you probably will say is that she's referring to the same event by the word amalgamation, that it means the intermarriage between the races. The problem with that argument is that first, it's clearly not what she wrote about, in my opinion. And you have the following problem. What you guys claim is that by amalgamation, she meant the mixture of man and animal. But you then are changing the word amalgamation to be both moral and physical. You're saying that a singular amalgamation modifies the humans in one way, but the animals in another way. In the animals, it modifies them physically, but in the humans, it modifies them spiritually. That is an absolute mental gymnastics, because how can you have amalgamating animals and humans separately, which requires the word to mean different things in the same sentence from a single use for different subjects? I don't get how this is even possible. If she said amalgamation of man and of beast, then you have a point. If she said amalgamation of man and amalgamation of beast, then you have a point. If she said amalgamation of man and beast, then you also have a point. But she says amalgamation of man and beast. So you have one amalgamation, one. You cannot make it two. There is only one amalgamation that needs to modify the subjects equally. If it modifies the animals physically, then it modifies the people physically as well. And that is how I would argue from the contextual argument that she meant the literal amalgamation. Literal, somehow they mixed. Now, some people say that the pre-flood people were very smart, so they had gene technology to mix the species, and that's how they did it. Other people argue for bestiality. I don't care which one is true, but they would both say that the black race came from the mixture of men with beast. That's what they're claiming. And I would say that this is absolutely not biblical. It cannot be true. Therefore, Ellen White, whatever she wrote there, it's false. I also have a friend called Adventist Watchman. He's an Adventist who makes videos mostly about 1844, but on the topic of the amalgamation, he agrees with me. He would say that the spiritual amalgamation is a mental gymnastic. He would say that what Ellen White meant were the people in the 19th century who participated in those circus performances that had such distinct mutations. For example, there are pictures with guys who are covered in hair so much that they resemble animals. And he would make the argument that the amalgamation is literal, but it is about a very small percentage of the population. That is his argument. But he still agrees it's physical. And he's the one who gave me the argument for the intermarriage. If Ellen White wanted to say people mixed with people, she would use the word intermarriage, as she did before in the same book. If she says amalgamation, she's mixing different things. And that is my presentation. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you finished in about 30 minutes. So I'll try not to go beyond that myself.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So let's see. I'll open mine and present my responses, and then I guess after that we'll talk back and forth. All right. Let's see. Okay. Open up mine here. Start at the beginning. And I'll time myself. Okay. All right. Can you see mine?
Yeah, I definitely do.
Okay, so just says amalgamation there. Okay, so basically, right from the start, I want to say that there is no Adventist doctrine of the amalgamation. There's no fundamental belief called the doctrine of the amalgamation. All of our fundamental beliefs are based on the scripture, every one of the 28. And also you had pointed out, I think, that Uriah Smith had originated or that he wrote the 28 fundamental beliefs, but he did not. No one single person originated the 28 fundamental beliefs. They were the result of Bible study over time. Ellen White didn't originate these doctrines. And even if it were the case that Ellen White were a false prophet, and I did a video on this called Ellen White Not a Test. Accepting Ellen White's prophetic ministry is not a test of membership to the church. And all of our 28 fundamental beliefs are based on the Bible. So when a person studies and becomes an Adventist, they study these 28 fundamental beliefs, and those are basically all Bible studies. The texts that support and explain each of those beliefs are all texts from the Bible. None of them are from Ellen White. So I wanted to say that right from the start before I get into this. Now, this is a statement here from Ellen White, and it relates to the preamble to the 28 fundamental beliefs, which is that the Bible is our only creed. Ellen White writes, I recommend you, dear reader, the Word of God as the rule of your faith and practice. By that word we are to be judged. God has, in that word, promised to give visions in the last days, not for a new rule of faith, but for the comfort of his people, and to correct those who err from Bible truth. So ultimately, it's the Bible that we are to look at. So theoretically, if somebody said, well, I'm not going to, I don't believe that Ellen White, what she's saying lines up with the Bible, and they say she's incorrect, there are all different kinds of views in the Adventist Church when it comes to Ellen White. Officially, yes, as the 18th fundamental belief makes clear, the official position of the church is that Ellen White was a prophet, and that the prophetic ministry was revealed in her life. But individually, even I myself, when I became an Adventist, I said to the people, I'm not sure that Ellen White is a prophetess, but that did not stop me from being baptized. So on an individual level, there are different views. I do believe that Ellen White was a prophetess, and I do believe that her writings are inspired, but the Bible, her writings are not on equal with the Bible. They're not on the same level with the Bible. And ultimately, the reason I conclude that she is a prophetess is because of what the Bible says. So the Bible is the standard that we hold her writings to and that we're to test everything by. But Adventists do have, even those who agree that she's a prophetess may have different views on how to understand her ministry. So I just wanted to get that out of the way before I continue here, that it is the Bible that we're to go by. So theoretically, if a person joins the church and they're not sure, or maybe they don't even agree that Ellen White is a prophetess, that is not to stop them from joining the church. They're to join based on the fundamental beliefs, and as fundamental belief 18 makes clear, they are to understand the official view of the church, but in the baptismal vow, it doesn't mention Ellen White. However, if they come in the church and they're going to start arguing with people, knowing that you are coming into a church where this is the official view, and you start creating controversy in the church, based on that, there can be disciplinary actions taken, because now you're creating controversy in the church. But she is not to be used as a test of membership, and none of our doctrines are based on her writings. She didn't originate any of the 28 fundamental beliefs, and if it were said that she were not a prophetess, that would not negate Adventism. Adventism doesn't stand and fall on whether Ellen White is a prophetess or not, like Mormonism does. In Mormonism, if Joseph Smith is not a prophet, that's the end of Mormonism, but not the case with Adventism. Just wanted to say that. So that's the direction I go when it comes to my ministry. But because we're focusing in on her statements on amalgamation, I wanted to deal with this topic. Now, this presentation that I have here, I just want to point out, much of this is coming from Kevin Morgan's chapter, Answering a Prejudicial Charge, in his book, Journeying to the Same Heaven. And the reason that's the case is because I know that Kevin Morgan and you have had some interaction, and there was the point made that you were making to the effect that Kevin Morgan wasn't dealing fairly with what you had presented, or that the Advent Defense League didn't as well and didn't give you the time. So I wanted to give you the time to do your presentation. But Kevin Morgan also felt that you didn't deal with all of the relevant statements of Ellen White. So I wanted to present some of that in this response. So here we see the statement. This is the key statement from 1864, Third Spiritual Gifts. This is the one that was read, so I'm not going to read this again. But this was already read. And also page 75, with, of course, that last sentence: since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen in the almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men. 1870, once again, we see, but if there was one sin above another which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, it was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere. God purposed to destroy by a flood that powerful, long-lived race, and that had corrupted their ways before him. And then once again, every species of animal which God had created was preserved in the ark. The confused species which God did not create, which were the result of amalgamation, were destroyed by the flood. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen in the almost endless varieties of species of animals and in certain races of men. Now, what is also important to point out is that before the flood, it's speaking of something that was sinful. If there was one sin above another, which was called for which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, and so then it is mentioned that it is the base crime of amalgamation. But when it comes to what's said about after the flood, since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, it doesn't necessarily say that amalgamation after the flood was sinful. Now, you can make of that what you will, but it doesn't necessarily say that in the statement. It's really pointing to what happened before the flood. And then in 1888, consider that the desire for a single gratification of appetite introduced sin into the world with its terrible consequences. Unhallowed marriages of the sons of God with the daughters of men resulted in apostasy, which ended in the destruction of the world by the flood. So obviously, as the Bible commentary and Francis Nichol and Frank Marsh point out, the amalgamation, and that's my position as well, is referring to these unhallowed marriages. This is what Ellen White continually brings up. This is what the Bible brings up in Genesis chapter 6. And that is the position that the Bible commentary takes. So again, to say that, I know in your discussion on the Mind and Messiah channel about 6 months ago, I think the discussion was entitled The Adventist Doctrine of Amalgamation. But I think it should be fair that there is no Adventist doctrine of the amalgamation. None of our doctrines are based solely on statements of Ellen White. And even if you want to take that position, the fact that the Adventist Bible commentary goes along with Frank Marsh, which is that the position is that the amalgamation is referring to this intermarriage between the line of Seth and the line of Cain, then that is the position that the commentary has taken. And so if we want to say there is an Adventist doctrine of amalgamation, it would have to be that this is referring to the intermarrying of the line of Cain and the line of Seth, regardless of how these things were understood for 70 years or in the past. Otherwise, I think it's unfair to say there is a doctrine of amalgamation in the church. Surely we don't make anybody study a doctrine of amalgamation that's just based on a couple of statements of Ellen White in order to become an Adventist. As I said, all of our beliefs are to be aligned with the Bible. And again, this also comes with how we understand Ellen White herself. If we say that she's a prophetess and we come to that conclusion, then of course we're going to say that what she's saying must square up with the Word of God. But if we say that she's not, then we're obviously going to say, no, it doesn't have to square up with the Word of God, and it can be completely wrong. It's just like the Bible itself. People will have the same Bible, but they'll interpret it different ways. And so when it comes to the writings of Ellen White, that is what has happened. Amalgamation is a mixing that should not occur in this context of before the flood. The focus of amalgamation is on the union and the offspring. Sexual immorality versus amalgamation. Sexual immorality is the focus on the sexual act and its immorality, but amalgamation is a focus on the union and its result. There obviously can be an overlap. Pre-flood amalgamation, focus of Ellen White. Humans, the sons of God, the daughters of men, union against God's will, and the result is the Nephilim. Animals, breeding and experimentation, confused species or breeds, perhaps for food, sport, fun, or perverse purposes. And so again, two distinct focus on lust and carnal desire. For example, first Spirit of Prophecy, page 68, we see instead of doing justice to their neighbors, they carried out their own unlawful wishes. They had a plurality of wives, which was contrary to God's wise arrangement. In the beginning, God gave to Adam and Eve, showing to all who should live up upon the earth his order and law in that respect. The transgression and fall of Adam and Eve brought sin and wretchedness upon the human race, and man followed his own carnal desires and changed God's order. But then when we go to the focus on unions, contrary to God's purpose and results, we see here on page 69, but there was one sin above another, which called for the destruction of the race by the flood. It was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere. So this is the focus on the union and the results of that union. Deface the image of God. In humans, future generations would not behave in godly ways. Spiritual perversion would also be a result. Moral perversion, physical results of perversions would increase. Disease, for example, etc. And in animals, breeds and species would lose genetic information and would grow further away from the originally created kind. But there was a physical result, obviously, in terms of the offspring that would occur between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Yes, there was physical results, but of course there was also the spiritual results. Now, when we look in Romans chapter 1, 22 to 25, professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into the image of man, like corruptible, into the image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. It was the base crime of amalgamation of man and beast, which defaced the image of God. The defacing of the image of God can be thought of in two ways. In one way, you deface the image of God by not reflecting God. When a person looks at you and how you behave, do they see God in you or not? But on the other hand, it could deface the image of God in terms of the way you see God. If you behave like an animal, if you behave following your emotions and your lusts and your passions, you end up behaving in a way that is not in accordance with godly character, and also in terms of how you see God. The image of God can be defaced in the mind of man. So, for example, the worship of animals, seeing God in the image of an animal or made after the image of some kind of even of man. You think of some of those images, for example, in Hinduism of an elephant god, for example. This is a defaced image of God in the minds of people. So the understanding of what God is defaced in terms of how people see God. When we don't see God properly, we view God in a way that is not correct. A vengeful God or even an immoral God or a perverse God, as any false religion would reveal. So God is defaced in the mind in terms of how he is seen or understood. The glory of the incorruptible God is turned into the image of corruptible man. But also in our own lives and how we reflect God, God can be defaced in that way. man's worship of the creature, behaving like a creature. Leviticus 18:22 to 24 speaks of an amalgamation. Now, obviously, this amalgamation wouldn't have physical, but it would have spiritual results. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is abomination. Nor shall you mate with any animal to defile yourself with it. Nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is perversion. So this is an amalgamation which wouldn't produce physical offspring, but would produce spiritual offspring. Obviously, a culture like that of these nations, these Canaanite nations that God had cast out before Israel, and these pagan nations, they had a culture that was embracing bestiality and homosexuality and perversions of these different kinds. And when it comes to bestiality in this case, there would be spiritual offspring. If you grow up in an environment where that is the norm, that's going to obviously be passed on. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these things the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. So these are the things that the nations were practicing that God cast out before Israel. So when we go back to that Romans passage in Romans 1 from 23 onward, we do see the worshiping, the making the image of God after the corruptible image of man and animals and things like that. And then the perverse actions that come from it. If you worship a beast, or if you worship the creature rather than the creator, you're going to behave like a beast. You're going to behave like an animal. And so that's a spiritual form of amalgamation. Man made in the image of God. But when man doesn't behave godly, he is defacing the image of God. Christ restores God's image, 2 Corinthians 3:18. But we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of God, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. And so that should be the case. We should be transformed into the image of God. Because of sin, the image of God was marred in humanity. Again, we see in Colossians 3:18 and verse 10, and have put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him. So Christ restores the image of God in us. Do people see Christ in you? Christ's image is seen in individuals by their lives, characters, and actions, and how those things reflect Christ. Now, when it comes to people, the offspring, the results of the union, are considered in the Bible. It says here in Malachi chapter 2:15, and did he not make them one, having a remnant of the Spirit? And why one? He seeks godly offspring. God seeks godly offspring. Hosea 5:7 says, they have dealt treacherously with the Lord, for they have begotten pagan children. So Israel begot pagan children. So there is physical offspring. Now, when we consider that with the line of Cain and the line of Seth, there would be physical offspring, and there would be, to some degree, physical results, but there's also the spiritual. Now, obviously, animals, and considering amalgamation of animals and that of people, people are made in the image of God, and people are not the same as animals. So when we consider the amalgamation, it's not going to be the same, because it's not the same thing, but it is amalgamation. That is the focus. So I think to say, well, in one case it's spiritual and the other it's physical, I think we do have to consider that when it comes to the spiritual with human beings, that is important, because God made man in his image and we have a mind. And so the effects of the amalgamation when it comes to humanity and the effects of amalgamation when it comes to animals, we do have to consider the differences, because animals are not people. They're not held to the same standard. But at the same time, there was physical offspring when it comes to the Nephilim that are discussed in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4. The Nephilim, they were the fallen ones, or I think another translation says the giants. So to a certain degree, there was physical offspring when or physical results. When there is amalgamation between people groups, there are physical differences, but that's not sinful. Ultimately, the concern is the sinful aspect, the spiritual aspect, because that is what is important when it comes to humanity, the spirituality. Animals can't be judged on that level because they don't have spirituality. Samaritans are an example of amalgamation as well, in a different sense. The Bible makes clear, though, that in 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. This is emphasized throughout the Bible. For what fellowship has righteous with lawlessness? Now, when it comes to the Samaritans, the ultimate issue, yeah, there was physical amalgamation, and there would have been physical results of that. But the key issue is the spiritual. Now, in Genesis chapter 6, from 1 to 4, we see the issue, which is really the sons of God and the daughters of men. And that is brought up and emphasized in connection to the flood. And so when Ellen White is speaking about this base crime of amalgamation, obviously I understand her to be speaking in line with what the Bible itself says and what is emphasized throughout the Bible. Now, again, in 2 Kings 17:29, we see the policy of Assyria was basically to amalgamate different people groups. However, every nation continued to make gods of its own and put them in the shrines on high places with which the Samaritans had made, every nation in the cities where they dwelt. And these are a couple of commentaries. I'm not going to read all of this for the sake of time, but I could refer back to this in the future. But basically, it was the policy of the Samaritans to amalgamate people, to mix people together, mix people groups together, and to cause a disintegration of national identity. It served their policy. And the Samaritans were the result of this Assyrian policy. The Assyrians purposely did that. This is from a non-Adventist website that's basically saying the same thing. Torah.com. Torah.com is saying this. However, the Assyrians, however, spread their deportees around with the goal of assimilating them into their new regions and thus making them disappear as separate identities. And we see that God's people were not to amalgamate with the pagan nations, as is seen in Exodus 34, 15, and 16. It was a problem, obviously, brought up in the book of Ezra, Ezra 9, 1 to 3, when the Israelites began to marry the pagans, the Canaanites, and the Hittites. Again, the same problem that is brought up in Genesis chapter 6. And the Bible is clear that there is a union that occurs between two people, and obviously there is a spiritual result. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body with her? For the two, he says, become one flesh. So there is the physical aspect, and this is the language of marriage. When we read in the book of Genesis about marriage, the two became one in chapter 2 of Genesis. But there is also the spiritual, which is the concern here. Again, Leviticus 18, 22 to 24 speaks of also a perversion of amalgamation with animal, which would have spiritual results. The results of amalgamation have to be considered in two senses, the physical and the spiritual. But in none of this, and it is not obviously my position, and as far as what I know to be the generally accepted understanding in the Adventist Church, there is no race. Well, ultimately there's only one race when it comes to humans. But as far as people groups and different races in that sense, there's no race that is the result of man having offspring with animals so that we could say that this race has some animal blood in them. Ellen White's vocabulary when it comes to species, it does seem to overlap in a lot of ways with what we would call breeds. Ellen White used the term species and breed and variety in ways that reflected a broader, less technical vocabulary of the 19th century. In some contexts, her use of species appears closer to the modern readers would call breeds or varieties. Think about all the different breeds of horses or hens or goldfish even, or dogs or cats. Amalgamation, meaning, and examples. So these are some that Kevin Morgan points out. Amalgamation. According to Noah Webster in 1828, amalgamation meant the mixing or blending of two different things. Victorians generally used amalgamation to refer to the commingling of different races, classes, or groups of people. Sometimes the distinction of people groups was ideological or spiritual. By amalgamation, I mean the union of natives with settlers in the same community, as master and servant, as fellow laborers, as fellow citizens, and if possible, as connected by intermarriage. So these are examples of amalgamation from these various time periods in the 1800s, where we're not talking about amalgamation of beast, having sexual relationships with people. We're talking about different groups of people. The sudden amalgamation of all denominations would be productive of great evil. So this is an example of religions, denominations joining together. It should be borne in mind that when we term what we term Caucasian races are not of one origin. They are, on the contrary, an amalgamation of an infinite number of primitive stocks of different instincts, temperaments, and mental physical characteristics. So again, these are examples of amalgamation referring to people groups joining together, not people with animals. And here we read of Robert Dale Owen. This is 1864. I believe that the effect of general emancipation will be to discourage amalgamation. John Kinney, an intelligent colored man, said, the majority of colored people don't like the intermarriage of colored and white people. So that's what this Robert Owen is speaking of. He's talking about intermingling of people groups when he uses the term amalgamation. Significant uses of amalgamation appear in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. This is from 1871. I'm almost done with my time here. While investigating the Hermitage of the tomb of President General Jackson, I had some conversation with quite an intelligent Negro. Again, I don't mean to use offensive language. I'm just reading the language of the time, this quote, who freely admitted that his condition was worse since his freedom than before, while at the same time, he said that with many it was bettered, parting families by selling, and the whipping they received, he said, was the worst of slavery. And I thought he might have added also the amalgamation of their race, which looks to me the greatest of all the sins found in slavery or elsewhere, when human beings are propagated as beasts for wealth or gain, the destruction of all moral principles that should be held sacred. And when men even traffic in their own blood, I wonder what God has been so long-suffering as he has. So he's talking about amalgamation in terms of people with people. In other words, breeding people, breeding them like animals, to say, okay, we want, hey, this slave female is a very strong and robust slave female, and we want to have strong children, and so let's have her breed with another man or amalgamate. So basically human breeding, kind of like what you might think of in terms of in Plato's book, the Symposium, I believe it might have been, where he speaks of something similar, the idea of breeding the best people with each other, or even in terms of thinking of the Aryan race and Hitler and the Third Reich, and this idea of, getting the strongest examples or strongest samples of people and producing super people by breeding the right kind of people based on their genetics. So this is talking about human amalgamation. Spurgeon. Oops, okay, I think I am just about, no, that was I got 2 minutes left. Spurgeon over here also uses the term amalgamation. This is Charles Haddon Spurgeon. I don't have time to read the whole quote, but he is clearly talking of amalgamation of the people of God with the world as their crowning offense of all. So this is language similar to Ellen White speaking of the base crime, or if there was one sin above another. And Spurgeon, this is 1873, he's using that language of amalgamation to discuss the intermingling of the sons of God with the daughters of man. And Martin Luther also used that type of language as well, speaking of amalgamation and speaking of intermarriage. Don't have time to read the quote. Okay. We have the statement by Paine. Willie noted that Buckner Paine, who authored the above statement under a pseudonym, was a pro-slavery Southerner who published his book. And so Paine is mentioned. I know you mentioned Paine, but Paine, contrary to what you're saying, I disagree, and apparently there's some confusion there because Paine's book is not listed in the online inventory of Ellen White's libraries compiled by Johns, Poirier, and Graybill. So I'm not sure how you got the information that it was. From what Morgan is pointing out and what I've looked up and researched, it wasn't. Even if it was, that doesn't mean that she intends the same idea as Paine does. There's more to this, but let me stop now. I want to be fair. It's about 30 minutes in, but maybe we could have some dialogue and I could point out some of those other slides there. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I did hear a lot of things. How do you want to start? I mean, I think you mentioned the first 5 minutes that you can be an Adventist and ignore Ellen White.
Yeah.
I would absolutely disagree with that statement. I was an Adventist for 6 years. I'm very well aware of the distinctions. You said that.
Yeah,
I
no,
said that this is a doctrine.
I'm saying that because it's true. I mean, I know, and I'm not in agreement with it, but I even know pastors who downplay the ministry of Ellen White, and I don't agree with that. As I said, I do believe she is a prophetess, but not many Adventists aren't even familiar with her writings. And like I
Yeah,
said,
but I would say that
it's not a test. It's not a test of membership.
I understand they say that, but I
You
would say that this is inconsistent.
you might have been in a church where and I will grant you that there are some churches that are very fanatical and imbalanced when it comes to Ellen White.
Yeah, but there is a reason for that. That's my point. If you're a consistent Adventist, you must accept her in time. Yeah, maybe you can go there. You say, I have doubts about her. I will let time show me. That's fine. But you cannot go to your elder and say, I believe Ellen White is a false prophet, because either she's a true prophet or false prophet. You cannot put it in the middle, and he will never let you get baptized. If you openly say that
Actually,
she's not a prophet.
Actually, there was more nuance than just that one side or the other, and I have encountered it. There are people who will say, yes, she was a prophet, but they'll explain how this part of her writing may be incorrect or that, and they'll still say she's a prophet. Now, I could understand you saying, well, that I don't, that's not consistent, that isn't correct, but there is a lot of nuance, even among those who would say that she's a prophet.
So do you understand the criticism of the critics when they say that we don't care when Ellen White is speaking as a human, we only care when she is speaking under inspiration?
Yeah. Yeah, I know there are those
Because I
that would
don't
say
have
that.
problems if he says, I personally recommend you don't eat that. That's fine. But when you say what God has told me, that is a problem. That has to either be true or false. If you say that it's false, then she turns out to be a false prophet by definition.
Well, when it comes to the Bible, let's take Paul's writings. Are all of Paul's writings included in the canon of Scripture? Everything he ever wrote?
No.
No. And so in the Bible, you have prophets that their writings are not contained in the Bible at all. Saul was among the prophets, King Saul. There were prophets. There were a bunch of prophets that were hidden in a cave by Obadiah. Miriam was a prophet. Some prophets that are mentioned in the Bible, we have their writings. They may have contributed to the canon of Scripture as we have them, but there are other prophets in the Bible whose writings are not even contained in the Bible. So
that is perfectly fine. The problem is whether it's true or false. I personally am not sola scriptura. I can grant that maybe prophets exist. That's fine. All I care about is whether they're true or false. Whether their scripture should be included in the Bible is a different topic, which I don't really care about. But when you say that you speak for God and what you say is false, that's a problem, regardless of whether what you wrote is canonical or not.
I think it's important to point out that when Ellen White writes, for example, when she wrote The Great Controversy, it is clear that she used other sources, not just her own, In other words, she had this general view. This was to be conveyed as she understood it, a general view of the unfolding of the controversy throughout history. And then to flesh it out, she would use other historical sources.
That is fine. I don't have an issue with that, but I would have an issue if she says, for example, I have never ever written a single sentence of heresy in all that I have written. I've never made one single mistake. That is what she said. So am I to believe that or not?
I think when you read that, you have to understand once again, what is she conveying by that? You have to read it in context. It's very hard to just make a statement and then say, what does she mean
Mhm.
by this? I would say, generally speaking, she would have visions that she understood, that I agree with, others don't, that she understood God was conveying a certain point of view, and that's what she's speaking about, the core message that she was bringing forth. Now to present that, she may use other sources, as I said with the Great Controversy. But um, to say that she has never uttered heresy, in order to call
Yeah,
it
that's not
heresy,
correct. Yeah.
yeah, you would have to show a conflict between what she wrote and the Bible. But the Bible must always come first, and she made it clear the Bible must come first.
Yeah, that's fine. But at the other places, she says if you reject her writings, you go blaspheme God directly. So when your fundamental rule 18 says that she is inspired and a prophet, I cannot go to Moses and say that he's wrong, that I disagree with him. That is not possible. So when you tell me that you don't have a doctrine to accept Ellen White, that is self-contradictory. I would say that this is not consistent. Your fundamental rule says that she's a prophet, and you must in time accept her. If you don't, then you're not consistent and you're going against the light of God, revelations from God.
Well, like I said, to become an Adventist, we go through the 28 fundamental beliefs, and they're all from the Bible. Ellen White is introduced in belief number 18, but she's not introduced by way of her own writings. She's introduced by way of what the Bible says a prophet should be. And then the person has the right to look at her writings and to study them. And nobody says, or, well, I shouldn't say nobody. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that goes on in the Adventist church and in any church. So I'm not going to say everybody abides by these standards correctly, but it is not supposed to be said to somebody that until you read, I mean, she wrote
Oh,
so
that's
many
fine. Yeah,
books.
if you say, well, I will read it later, that's fine. If you say right now you're not convinced, that is fine. But the point
Yeah.
is that at one moment in time, you must make a decision. You cannot put it on the side, be neutral about it. You must say at the end of the day whether she is a prophet or whether she is not, because there is no third alternative. Either she said these things from God or she didn't. It's very simple. I don't mind when somebody claims to be a prophet. That's fine. The point is to defend the claims. And if she's saying false things, then the whole church goes, you guys would be promoting a false prophet.
No, but what I would say to that brother is that that's the individual. That's the individual. Excuse me. That's the individual journey of a person. Um, not all prophets, as we could see, not all prophets in the Bible that are mentioned in the Bible had the purpose of producing the canon of Scripture. So to say Ellen White is a prophetess doesn't mean that her writings equal the canon of Scripture. As we see in the Bible, not all prophets in the Bible produced books that became the canon of Scripture. So when it comes to the Bible itself, we have the inspired prophets, and God, by the Holy Spirit, desired that certain of these writings would become what we have today as the Bible. So you might say there's this spiritual, in a sense, a spiritual filtration process by way, of the Holy Spirit that results in the Bible as we have it today. So we have the Bible. That's our canon of scripture. When it comes to Ellen White, we have all of her writings. We have everything. We don't have all the writings of Paul. We don't have all the writings of Isaiah. We have what God chose ultimately to be the canon of scripture, and that's our standard. So just because a person says Ellen White is a prophetess, and she makes clear that her writings are not for producing new doctrines, they're ultimately to point people back to the Bible. So again, the Bible is the standard. So even if a person says I have, and like I said, there's so much nuance when it comes to Ellen White, but on this topic in particular, when it comes to amalgamation, I didn't get to go through all my slides because I had a lot more put together than you. But can I pull up another slide right now connecting to what we're talking about?
Yeah, whatever you want. Yeah.
So let me show you this here. Let me just make a point here with this slide here. Okay. Okay. So Dr. T. Joe Willie omitted fuller context. So this was somebody was contradicting Ellen White, but he didn't put in the full context of the statement. I saw that the slave master. Well, no, this is let me read this. I saw that the slave master would have to answer for the soul of his slave, whom he has kept in ignorance, and all the sins of the slave would be visited upon the master. God cannot take the slave to heaven who has been kept in ignorance and degradation, knowing nothing of God or the Bible, fearing nothing but the master's lash, and not holding so elevated a position as the master's brute beasts. In other words, the master was treating the slave as a beast. She's not saying that the slave is a beast, but she's saying he was treated as a beast.
That's fine. I don't usually. Okay. If you wanna, we will continue the slides, or if you have more, I can wait. No problem.
Yeah, no. You respond to any. I want you to respond to these things.
So basically, from your presentation, I heard mostly 2 points that were illustrated from several places. They're basically the same argument, but in a different structure. It basically says this: the word amalgamation can be used in various contexts. It can mean many things. We definitely agree there. No problem there. No contention there. When you say it can be spiritual, yes, it does. When you say it's mixing different stuff, yes, it does. Nobody would disagree there. My problem is that all the examples that you gave, they are indeed about a spiritual type of what you can call amalgamation. That is fine. But I would make the argument that this is not relevant to the specific statements by Ellen White, because those two statements in her book are about a completely different, how do you call them, construction and time setting and so on. So when you read Spurgeon, when you read all these examples of other people,
Right.
that is not the same thing that Ellen White is speaking about.
But they do use amalgamation in that way, which is what I'm arguing is how she meant it to be used. It seems like you were basically saying it is to be understood in a way of a man and an animal mixing, and you were using it that way. But I was showing these other quotes where it's not used that way.
Yeah, but in the other quotes, first, they are not quotes of Ellen White, and second, she uses different word there, and third,
Yeah, but
it's
Paine
not
is
the
not
same
Paine
example.
is not Ellen White.
I agree, but I only brought Paine to argue that you can use the word amalgamation for physical union, only for that reason.
Yeah,
I didn't.
but brother, why would you assume that she meant the same thing as Paine?
That's my point. Let's go to the original quote and study from there.
Yeah.
Can you bring the original quote?
Okay. The quote of Ellen White in Spiritual Gifts?
Yeah, the two statements, yeah.
Okay, let's go back here.
It's in my slide, it's in your slide, whatever you want.
I have to share. Hold on a minute. I made a mistake here. Go back here.
Yeah, and I didn't hear any refutation to the historical sources, which means that you kind of agree with them, but you don't consider them an evidence. That is fine, but...
Oh, this one here, right? Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Right here.
Okay, go to the very first slide. Yeah, this one. Yeah, okay. Let's read from the beginning. Let's see which interpretation makes more sense. But if there was one sin above another, which called for the destruction of the race by the foot, it was the base crime of amalgamation of men and beasts, which defaced the image of God and caused confusion everywhere. Now, she's talking about one amalgamation, one, not two. So the question is she talking about only a spiritual amalgamation or only physical amalgamation? Which one is it?
Well, that's what I was saying. There is a spiritual result, and there is a physical result. There is a physical result of the line of Cain intermarrying with the line of Seth. They did have physical offspring, but obviously the key issue is the spiritual, which we can't possibly attribute to animals because animals aren't held accountable for their spirituality. So what I'm saying is we're dealing with animals and we're dealing with people. We're dealing with amalgamation, but when we deal with amalgamation between people who are made in the image of God, of course, what matters is their relationship with God and the spirituality. But obviously, they would have physical offspring. The Bible describes those physical offspring as Nephilim. I think
Hmm.
another translation says giants.
Yeah,
And there
that's
would
fine.
have
But
been physical results because, like I said, when you have an immoral culture develop, like we see after the flood with the Canaanites, and even if you think of Moab and Ammon, those are basically, biblically speaking, and in the way that Ellen White used it, we could say those were two races that Genesis chapter 19, and this would have been after the flood, they came about as a result of what? Incest.
that is fine. But the problem is that in all these examples, you have the word either intermarriage, incest, or amalgamation to mean only one type of pollution, one type of sin. You try to say that amalgamation can carry both, but it cannot carry both in the same sentence. You would need at least two amalgamations to do that. That's why the George Price from my presentation tried to do. He tried to modify the sentence to mean amalgamation of man and of beast. Then you can put your meaning. Then you can argue that men are modified morally, but animals are modified physically.
Well, can
But
I
that's not
can
what the
I
original quote says.
let me address that before I forget. Hold on. Let me just address what you just said there. Um, let me see over here. Let me open this up. I'm going to have to jump ahead here because of the idea of man and of beast. These were the Uriah Smith passages. And by the way, Uriah Smith never mentioned black people specifically. He referred to the Bushmen, the Hottentots, and the Patagonians. And I don't agree with what Uriah Smith said. And Ellen White never endorsed it.
She
I
didn't
know
name her book. What do
his
you
book
mean?
was, yeah, but his book was a general defense of Ellen White. That was just one small
But
area of
she,
the book.
but you have an entire chapter saying this. How do you have a book with an entire chapter claiming that these tribes came from animals?
I know, but what I'm trying to say is the general idea of the book was what they were endorsing and supporting. It wasn't that in any Ellen White never gave a blank check to anyone. If you read Great Controversies, he speaks in glowing terms of Luther, but Luther had anti-Semitic statements. Now we don't say that Ellen White was endorsing that, or when it came to Calvin and his idea of predestinations, he spoke positively. So she put them in a certain context. So just because she was quoting or endorsing the book, the general idea of the book was basically to defend Ellen White and her prophetic ministry. But that
Yeah,
doesn't mean
and
that everything.
when the critics make the specific charges about the amalgamation, Uriah is making a specific defense for their statements. How is she not supporting this? She knows that the critics are accusing
Yeah,
her
but
of literal interpretation.
his book is dealing with a bunch of accusations of critics
Yeah,
and getting
including this
into
one.
different topics, including that one. But that doesn't mean that again, that doesn't mean that she's endorsing every aspect of whatever he wrote. Otherwise, we'd be putting his writing on the same level as hers. We don't consider Smith to be a prophetess or a prophet.
He doesn't has to be. He's just explaining the sentence what she meant. I would argue that the plain statement of the original quote is very clear, and the reason why we have to go to these discussions is because you cannot agree to the literal text. It says amalgamation of man and beast. You try to put there spiritual, moral, some physical there, some spiritual there. I would say that you're the guys who modify the meaning. I would say that the quote is very, very clear.
Okay, well, let me take a look at a couple of other usages where she used the same term.
Mhm.
So, for example, if we look over here in 1854, so this would have been earlier. It says, when the destroying angel was to pass through Egypt to destroy the firstborn of man and beast.
Mhm.
So she's not saying an offspring or an amalgamation of man with beast here. She's saying that of man the firstborn would die, and of beast. So
But
that
notice
would
this
that
though.
well, it's
Notice
just showing.
the
Well, my point is,
continue.
it's the same. It's the same term. It's the same term, and it's clearly not pointing to an amalgamation of the two. Again, when we see over here in 1890, as the violence of the storm increased, trees, buildings, rocks, and the earth were hurled in every direction, the terror of man and beast. So again, when we look at her usage of that, it does mean of man and of beast. So the man that you
Okay,
were speaking of,
can you go to the previous slide? So notice what is the verb here that she is describing? She's saying
I don't,
destruction, right?
destroying angel.
Yeah. Is the destruction here? Basically, it says destroying angel to destroy, destroy. That is the action. Notice
Yes.
the action. The action is the same for the animal and for the human. You don't have spiritual destruction to the man and physical to the animals, or opposite. It is the same action toward the humans and toward the animals.
Yeah, but
But
what
when
I'm
it comes to the amalgamation, you're trying to say the amalgamation is physical only to the animals, but spiritual to the humans.
Yeah, but what I'm saying by pointing this out and pointing this passage out is that it does mean of man and of beast. So it's the same
Not of, I
term. So
wouldn't say of.
if we see that same term in the passage you're talking about in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, page 64 or 75, it's using that term, and it does literally mean of man and of beast. So the man that said that's what it should say, even though she didn't write it that way, that is consistent with how she does use the term. At least
But where
as
does
we
it say of man and of beast? It doesn't. It just says of man and beast.
no,
Now
but
I
here it
understand this.
says of man and beast too, but it does mean of
Yeah,
man and
not
of
of.
beast.
You don't have double of. Where do you have the second of?
But that's what I'm saying, brother. That she's not. Are you saying that she's saying here that when the destroying angel was to pass through Egypt to destroy the firstborn of man and beast, that she means to destroy amalgamations of man and beast?
No, I mean that here you don't have reference to the amalgamation at all. It just mentions man and beast, both groups. I agree that it's both groups. The problem is that the term is not amalgamation. The problem is that the term is a singular destruction that cannot be spiritualized or said that it has two meanings. It has one meaning, destruction. Both are
Yeah,
killed.
but you're making an assumption based on how you interpret amalgamation, and so based on that, you're saying it must mean of man with beast. But
The
I'm
reason I
saying
do is
I'm saying
because
that's
I'm
not how
choosing to
she's
believe.
using.
No, the question you need to answer yourself is how is she using the term amalgamation? You must choose only one type of definition. I can agree it can be spiritual, it can be physical, but you're trying to say that in the same sentence it's both. That's what I disagree with. You need to tell me whether it's physical or spiritual.
But
If you
if we're
say that it's
dealing with
spiritual, it must be,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
If you say that the amalgamation is spiritual, you need to say that it's spiritual for the animals as well. What you're trying to say is only spiritual for the people.
Yeah, but how could it be spiritual for the animals? Animals don't, God doesn't take into
I
account.
agree. Yeah, that's why I say it's physical. It's
But
physical
yeah,
for the people and it's physical for the animals.
I'm saying it is physical for both the people and the animals, but ultimately people are held accountable for their spirituality. We can't apply that to the
Well,
animals.
okay. So Uriah did say that the physical amalgamation caused a moral decline in the humans. Yes, there is a moral effect, I agree, but it is because of the physical amalgamation. And if you go to the very first, go again to the very first quote of Ellen White.
You want the one that, okay, hold on.
Yeah, the main statement. I agree that there is a spiritual component, but she's not discussing the spiritual component. You can derive the spiritual component, but that's not what she's talking about. She's talking about the physical mixture, and other
Okay,
authors are describing the
this is,
moral later.
okay, here we are. This one?
Yeah, now notice the second verse. Yeah. every species of animal which God had created were preserved in the ark. The few species which God did not create, He did not create them, which were the result of the amalgamation, were destroyed by the flood. Now, since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast, as may be seen. Where am I to see it? I am to see it into the animals and the humans in the 19th century. So, am I observing a physical one or spiritual one? One amalgamation,
But do
one type
you,
of amalgamation.
when you read this, when she says over here, if there was one sin above another, which called for the destruction of the race by the flood, she's saying that what happened before the flood, there was something sinful about it. She doesn't say that the amalgamation after the flood is necessarily always sinful.
How is it okay? When how is it not simple if she says that the previous sentence says the few species which God did not create, they were destroyed. Then she gives example how this practice, the same practice of amalgamation, whatever it was, whether it's spiritual or physical, continued after the flood.
Well,
If it was simple, yeah.
there could be, obviously there's amalgamation that is sinful and there's amalgamation that isn't sinful. If you have,
How is it not
if you,
simple in these two verses?
well, because we want to pay attention with what the Bible is focusing on. It is focusing on the problem of 2 Corinthians 6:14. The godly should not be unequally yoked with the ungodly. That's the amalgamation that is concerned. But if you say amalgamation in terms of animals, breeding different breeds of horses or different breeds, that is amalgamation, but that's not necessarily a sinful thing.
But
Or
she said,
or if
as may be
you
seen in the varieties. I'm supposed to look at the animals and the humans and notice the same amalgamation. They're the same, not spiritual in one and physical in others.
but then you're disqualifying what it is to be a human and what it is to be an animal. You're saying that none of that should be considered. The nature of humans is not the nature of animals.
Yeah,
Animals
but
are
she's
animals
talking
are not
about
made in the
physical
image of
features.
God.
I agree, but the point is that she's saying that I'm supposed to notice the evidence of the amalgamation, the physical mutations to the people that are the same in the animals. That is her
Well,
point. That is what am I
that's your
supposed to
but
observe.
that's your how you're interpreting it.
No, that's the main reading of the text. Since the flood, there has been amalgamation, which may be seen. One amalgamation, which may be seen in certain animals and certain humans. It's physical. It's all physical. Nothing to do with morality. I'm not supposed to observe the morality of the animals to get the morality of the people. I'm supposed to see the common distinctive mutation. That is the effect of the amalgamation that she's talking about. It's
I
very clear, man. That's
understand
why you
that.
interpret it physically.
I understand that's what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that's not consistent with what she wrote. If, for
Where?
example, if we look over here, and again, would you at least concede that there is no Adventist doctrine of amalgamation in terms of a unified binding doctrine whereby
Oh, yeah,
everybody.
definitely. Yeah. If you have heard me say that this is a doctrine, this is not a doctrine. If I have said that somewhere, or maybe my friend Martin Messiah wrote that as an article title, that's wrong. Yeah, that is not a doctrine that you must believe, but it is a revelation that she claims came from God. So I would say, how do you reject the light of God? Either it's true or false.
Okay, well, what I'm saying is if we allow her writings, if we judge her writings by her writings, we're not going to conclude that. For example, there's a stream of texts that Kevin Morgan put together from the passages in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, and going up to 1890. And we see in 1869, for example, she writes, and is a crime now which constitutes one of the signs of the last days, even as marriages were a crime, the way they were managed previously to the flood. So she's talking about these intermarriages.
Yeah, intermarriage. Yeah, she doesn't use the word amalgamation here, which is
And
my argument. She already dealt with the intermarriage in the previous chapters.
okay, well, this one is 1879. The descendants of Seth separated themselves from the wicked descendants of Cain. They cherished the knowledge of God's will, while the ungodly race of Cain had no respect for God and his sacred commandments. But when men multiplied upon the earth, the children of Seth saw that the daughters of the descendants of Cain were beautiful, and they departed from God and displeased him by taking wives. So this is the same idea. This is 1879, 1882. Unhallowed marriages of the sons of God with the daughters of men resulted in apostasy, which ended in the destruction of the world by the flood. So she's clearly talking about this intermarriage as one of the key reasons for the flood in these different passages. Following up here again, 1882, the scriptures briefly state that the reason for the prevailing iniquity in Noah's day, the sons of God married the daughters of men. So this is, and again, 1888, the great crime, in other words, we could say the base crime, same concept, the great crime in the marriages of the days of Noah was the sons of God formed alliances with the daughters of men. And then, of course, you have the 1890 passage. So we see a stream of passages from Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, back in the 1860s to 1890s, and it's consistent that she's saying that the problem was the sons of Seth and the daughters of Cain.
So I would agree with you that all these passages that you read, they speak on the same point. They speak on the point of intermarriage. That is fine. But this is my argument. She already dealt with that problem here in the passages that you mentioned. And she never uses the word amalgamation, but intermarriage. What you and Kevin Morgan are trying to say, that she's repeating the same point, that she's using amalgamation to be synonymous for intermarriage. And I disagree, because if she's later mentioning what happened because of the amalgamation, then she's speaking about a different event in the same chronology, before and after the flood. Because obviously she said a great crime, I agree, but she could have said base crime again. She doesn't. But do you know where she says base crime? She says bestiality is a base crime. She says that.
Yeah, and that is one form of amalgamation, as I pointed out. But that's not the
Yeah, and I would argue that
amalgamation
the
that
bestiality is with animals, yeah.
But that, yeah, bestiality is between man and animals, and obviously is a base crime that the Bible does say happened in Leviticus 18. So it did happen. That was amalgamation after the flood. It wouldn't produce viable offspring, but the amalgamation before the flood that the Bible is emphasizing, and that's what Ellen White is talking about, is between the sons of God and the daughters of men. That did have physical results, and it did have spiritual. Now, the question about
Okay.
why does she not use the word? Let me just pull up this slide over here. Hold on. Let me just pull this slide up. Okay. Can you see? Wait. Okay. Okay, after the Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, 1870, why would Mrs. White omit the term amalgamation in all of her explanations of the cause of the flood, which we looked at those passages? It says there is good reason. Ellen White's son, W.C. White, wrote, the answer is easily found. It was the fear that wicked men with with hatred in their hearts for certain races of men better than themselves, races of men better than themselves, would misapply and misuse it to the injury of those they hate. To have used the word amalgamation for a book intended for the general public would carry unintended implications. As we have seen, amalgamation became a term of choice for intermarriage between whites and blacks, and some would have erroneously read into Mrs. White's statements the intermarriage of blacks and whites. So because of the way that people were understanding it,
Yeah.
she didn't use the word, but it doesn't mean she's not talking about the
So
same
who
thing.
wrote this though? Who wrote this?
This is from the paper of Kevin Morgan, and here he's quoting from Ellen White's son, W.C. White.
Where did he write this?
There's the note, the footnote there. I could find that if you want. You want me to find it?
So
I could give it to you.
LCW White, whom I read that he interprets the quote literally, he is afraid that somebody will misapply her mother's writing, even though he himself interprets the quote literally, as I do.
Well, I just want to give you the reference here first before I deal with that. It is 73 here. all these are, you can download this paper, but this is letters between Dr. David Paulson and Ellen White. This is 73, note 73. Dr. David Paulson and Ellen White answer the matter of infallibility in her writing. Paulson wrote, Mrs. White, I was led to conclude that most firmly believe that every word that you ever spoke in public or private, that every letter you wrote under any and all circumstances was as inspired as the Ten Commandments. I held that view with absolute tenacity, he goes on to say, against innumerable objections raised to it by many who were occupying prominent positions in the Adventist cause. And this was from a letter to Ellen White, April 19, 1906, in, quote, correct views concerning the testimonies, a reply to an inquirer. This is from Review and Herald, August 30th. You know what I'm reading? I'm reading the note, I think I'm
Yeah, I
sorry.
think
I'm
Kevin
sorry.
Morgan
I'm
is
reading
trying to summarize something, but that is not the.
no. This quote here was 72. I was reading. I'm sorry about that. 72 is W.C. White. Some early statements. Why not reprinted? DF 316. So that's the note for that one. Sorry about that. I was reading all that
No,
stuff,
okay.
but
Can you
that
read
wasn't.
who wrote this though? I mean, they're claiming that Willie wrote this.
Yeah, this is
When can I see
yeah.
this?
That was the reference I gave you. 70 again. This isn't. You can download this
But by
paper if
who?
Kevin.
Who is this? I think that the guy is just making.
No, this is
I think that.
W.C. White. W.C. White, quote, some early statements, why not reprinted, end quote, DF 316. That's the quote. That's W.C. White saying that.
Oh, can you read it from there? I mean, I want to see the whole context of this.
Oh, I don't have that. You'd have to look that up, but I don't have that right here. I'm just taking what's in the
Because I think
paper.
that Kevin is right now summarizing what somebody else had said about Willie White.
According to what he's saying here, it's W.C. White who's saying this. He's saying Willie C. White wrote this. You can go back
I
and
need,
go
yeah,
into the
okay. I need to
context
see the
and
source of this here.
are
I
you, are
think that
you
there is some
so you're saying Willie C.
conflating.
Wright didn't write this?
Yeah, or maybe somebody's replying for him versus he himself writing this because I already quoted how Willie White interpreted the quote. He literally agreed with me. D. Robinson, the secretary, agreed with me. And if what you just said here is correct, then Ellen would definitely correct Uriah Smith. She's selling a book that has an entire chapter saying this, but she was afraid how the public would receive the message, according to what you just read. How is
So
this not a living
you're
contradiction?
saying that you're saying that unless she specifically spoke against that statement of Ellen White, that she must agree with it.
No, I'm saying Willie just what you just read that Willie White said that her mother was afraid of how the public would take the statements. That's why she removed the statements from some of her works, right?
It was obviously you yourself read quotes where people
Then
did
why didn't she
understand it
correct
that
Uriah
way.
Smith? Yeah. But why did then she took the book of Uriah Smith and promoted it if she was afraid how the public would take it?
Well, one of the things with Ellen White was that she would constantly wait on the Lord for her to receive a firm, thus saith the Lord, and then she would speak. There were times where she was silent about things. It doesn't mean that she endorsed it. That's making an argument from silence. Just to theorize about why she didn't just directly say something then, and then to assume that it's because she must be in agreement with Uriah Smith that's not logical really. Can't make an argument from
I would say it's
silence.
very logical if you have all the pioneers agreeing with me for 70 years. Nobody believed your stuff before 70 years. Nobody. What you're proposing is a modern invention. And even the
No,
author in
no.
Uriah case said that it was popular during his days to believe that the crosses between man and animals were possible. That's what your own guys say. That's what Uriah believed. That was his time. That's what Ellen White
Say
believed.
that again. I'm sorry. Can you repeat
Can you
that?
open my presentation?
Uh, okay. Hold on a minute.
on the slide about Uriah Smith.
Oh, okay. Let me open yours. Hold on a minute. Every time I do this, I have to go back here. Okay. There. Okay, you want me to go to Uriah Smith?
Yeah.
Okay. Here we are.
Next slide.
Oh,
That is the critics. Yeah, this one. Yeah. So notice in the side corner
yeah.
where.
Okay.
Can you the previous slide? Yeah, the previous slide. Yeah, this one. So in the side corner, it writes Uriah Smith clearly reflected the popular idea of his time that crosses between men and animals had created a no man's land between man and beast, populated by gorillas, chimpanzees, wild bushmen of Africa, Patagonians, and Hottentots. That was the popular idea of his days.
Now you
And those are
look at
the same guys.
let's look at that again. Read that sentence one more time.
Uriah Smith clearly reflected the popular idea of his time that crosses between men and animals had created a no man's land between men and beasts, populated by gorillas, chimpanzees, wild bushmen of Africa, Patagonians, and Hottentots.
No, but that's not Uriah Smith's words himself.
Yeah, this is the Spectrum magazine Adventist debate.
Yeah, but
Marcia versus
I'm
Carroll.
not going to necessarily assume that when Spectrum says something, I should go by it. I have a lot of
They're just
issues with.
no, that is not the Spectrum opinion. They're just recording the conversation between Harold and Quark.
Okay,
So
but let's read Uriah Smith himself. You want to go back to where
let's read Uriah Smith, yeah. Okay.
read the pertinent passage in Uriah Smith, which is right up here, right?
Say what? Yeah, okay, yeah, we will see what Uriah. Okay, if you want me to read the whole thing, actually you can read it because your English is better than mine.
Well,
If you want to
this
start
one,
reading,
it's really this sentence right here where he mentions
which one?
I got
I
your.
don't see an arrow. If you have a pointer, I don't see a pointer in the screen.
Oh, yeah, I can't do that. But let me read this. I guess this is Uriah Smith, right? Yeah, let me read this. If they did, they could, let me see here, easily be silenced by reference to such cases as the wild bushmen of Africa, the tribes of the Hottentots, and perhaps the Digger Indians of our own country, etc. Moreover, naturalists affirm that the line of demarcation between the human and the animal races is lost in confusion. So he's bringing up these specific people groups here, Hottentots, Digger Indians,
Yeah.
and he's not saying the black race. He's bringing up when he brings up these Indians here or these Bushmen
Read the
over
first
here.
sentence.
The very first sentence?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, for some reason, let me see. Okay, here it is. The visions teach, says the objector, that the Negro race is not human. We deny it. So he's denying that.
Yeah, but he's not denying that they're mixed with animals. He's just denying the claim that they cannot be called human. Because the argument of the critic is that if you mix animal with human, you cannot call the product a human being. Uriah says we disagree. We can still call it a human, but they're still mixed with animals.
Okay, yeah, but like I said, Uriah Smith.
And he's still referring to the Negro race, the black race, and he's giving 3 tribes that represent that race.
He gives no, they're not all the Indians there that he's mentioned wouldn't be part of that group.
Fine. 2 of them are. Doesn't matter. He's writing the chapter to refute the critics who specifically argue for the Negro race.
Well, again, I said
that's what he means. Yeah, he
didn't say that. He didn't say the Negro race. I mean, he said the examples he gave were not the Negro race. To use his language, I again don't want to be offensive, but to use his language, those examples were not the Negro race.
Okay, let's say that Ellen White didn't mean the Negro race.
And I'm not saying I agree with it. I definitely don't agree with it, and I'm saying Ellen White didn't agree with it either. You can't. You would have to. You can't find in Ellen White's writings herself where she says, "I agree with." I
I
agree
would
with
argue that the main quote
Uriah
is enough.
Smith.
I would okay. Go back to Uriah Smith for a point. I just want to, and then go to the original quote of Ellen White. I want to show you something there.
You hold on. I just wanted to bring up something
Okay.
before I go to that that I'm looking for here. Let's see. Before I get to that. I'm trying to find a quote. I'll have to probably do it another time. But let me go. Which did you want me to go to?
Go again to Uriah and go then to the original quote.
Okay, I'm going back to
Or maybe
Uriah.
go first to the original quote and then to Uriah. Both are fine.
Okay, I'll go back to the original quote. Okay. Okay, that one.
No, yeah, that one, yeah. Okay. So notice, since the thought there has been amalgamation of men and beasts, as may be seen in the endless varieties of species of animals and certain races of men. Now go to Uriah. As may
Okay.
be seen. That is important.
Yeah.
And this is what Uriah says. Just a second. Where did he say that? Just a moment. There was amalgamation. This is what he says. The effect is still visible in certain races of men. So he's speaking about, just as Ellen White said, as may be seen. What may be seen? The evidence of the amalgamation. So if I'm to look to the races and the animals, I must see the same thing, the same, not different. Your view says that in the animals it's physical. I'm seeing physical stuff there, but spiritual in the humans. It doesn't make any sense. She must be talking about a singular amalgamation that may be seen in the animals and in the humans. That is why when you
Well,
cite
I
me
mean,
these
we,
examples
we,
of,
we keep going over that point, and I'm saying that humans are not animals. So we're not going to hold animals to the same standard as humans.
but what is she looking at both? Why is she pointing both? Because of their physical features, not morality. She's pointing to the animals and saying that these animals have physical features that are descendants of the confused species. And then she says that certain races of men also have the same features because they are also descended from the confused species. That's what she's saying. That's what we're to look at.
I think the problem is that you're using Uriah Smith to interpret what Ellen White meant, and I think what Kevin Morgan is doing is he's using Ellen White to interpret what she meant.
But what he's assuming his view. I can see clearly the text says, I must see the certain races of men and I must see the animals. What must I see in them? What? It cannot be the morals. Because she's not citing all races of men. She's saying certain races of men. She's specifying that it's about physicality, physical features. Nothing to do with morality.
Wait.
You're presupposing the morality from her other works, but her other works are on a different point, not this one.
Wait, let me, can I stop this share for a minute?
Yeah.
Let me read this. In preparing these, now this is, however, in publishing the 1866 rebuttal series, Smith issued the specific disclaimer. In preparing these answers, we have had no consultation whatever with Sister White, nor received any suggestion or explanation from her on any point. We take the visions as they are published and base our explanation on any apparent discrepancy on the language as it stands. So this is Smith saying this. This is
Mm-hmm.
note 43. So he's saying we didn't consult with Ellen White. This is his opinion, what he's reading. Later, W.C. responded to Warren G. Neeland, superintendent of the Bahamas Mission, that his mother did not endorse the explanation of Uriah Smith's booklet. So that's important. She didn't endorse it. And then he went on.
Okay, what
Marsh,
booklet though? Is it the same
this
book?
this is dealing with the what you. This is what we're talking about. Dealing with the statement of Uriah Smith. You keep going with. I'm
But
saying
Uriah
that
Smith wrote several.
she did not. This is what is being said by W.C. White and by Smith is that this is Smith's opinion. Again, it
Okay,
says
let's try to chronologically order this. You're saying first that Uriah never consulted with Ellen White when he was writing his defense, right?
this is Smith himself saying it.
Yeah,
This
Uriah
is a
Smith. Yeah, Smith is
statement.
saying.
This is published 1866. In publishing the 1866 rebuttal series, Smith issued a specific disclaimer, and
Yeah, and the
that's
disclaimer
the
is that he
disclaimer.
never consulted with Ellen White, right?
Yeah, in preparing these answers, we have had no consultation whatever with Sister White, nor
So when
received
it says
any
these answers,
suggestion, nor
yeah, fine. I'm
received.
just trying to see the source. Since Uriah wrote many books, he wrote many stuff. When it says these answers, is it specifically referencing this book or other books?
What do you mean? He's talking about this. He's talking about the what we're talking about here. This is the context of this whole paper. He's talking about these statements here. He's saying in preparing these answers, okay, however, publishing the 1866 rebuttal series, that's what we're dealing
18.
with.
Okay, which year?
1866.
Can I see in my slide I have the year of the book? Is it the same book? Let's see.
Okay. And you want to
Because I
go?
know that Uriah, for example, wrote something about Revelation that James White disagreed with. I understand that. So I'm asking whether it's for the same book.
Yes, this is his 1868. Yours says here.
And what did your source say? 18 what?
However, in publishing the 1866 rebuttal series,
So it's a different rebuttal series. It's not the
some
same source.
no, this is what he's talking about. That's the context of this whole paper. As far as
But his book is 2 years later. How can that be?
you're talking, well, let's go back to the quote. Where are we here in the paper? To Uriah Smith's quote. Uriah Smith's quote. Hold on.
And even if I agree with you, let's say that Uriah never consulted Ellen White before writing his book,
Yeah.
then that means that every pioneer who read the statement at face value interpreted like me.
This is 38. So we're talking about, hold on, let me just double check the year given in the paper. That's 38. 38. Okay. Smith's visions of Ellen White, a manifestation of spiritual gifts according to the scriptures. Page 102, 103. Okay, so it doesn't tell the year of the writing over there. But let me read this part here. Some have argued that Smith's line of reasoning was Ellen White's reasoning, and that it was endorsed by James White and accepted and expanded over the course of time by Ellen White's secretary, Doris E. Robinson, her son, William C. White, and scientist Harold Clark, among others. However, in publishing the 1866 rebuttal series, Smith issued that disclaimer, and that was the disclaimer that I read. I think when you consider that, and when you consider what we wrote, now, even if you say that's not the same book or that has nothing to do with this writing here, the same concept applies, because to assume that Ellen White meant the same, to assume that Ellen White meant the same thing as Uriah Smith, you don't have Ellen White ever saying that. You don't ever have her saying that because he said this, I mean what he said.
So she supposedly issued a disclaimer that she doesn't agree with him on the previous writings, but for this book, she literally takes 2,000 copies and save it like a newspaper.
Because what I said was the purpose of the book was defending her ministry, and it dealt with plenty of other subjects. It didn't just deal with that one thing. It was the broad idea of the book was being endorsed, not necessarily what Uriah Smith wrote in every single area. It's the
Yeah, but
concept.
it's one thing to have a minor disagreement for something that is not so, it's not a big deal, let's say a topic that is not that important. But if he writes such a offensive chapter that is extremely clear what it means, then should have corrected him. Her son agrees with me, her secretary agrees with me. Those are irrefutable sources, in my opinion. You're saying that only Ellen White, she had an opinion, nobody understood her for 70 years. Nobody, including her family, all the Adventists there, they were all deceived for 70 years.
Yeah, but if you look at it, look, what I'm trying to tell you is if you let Ellen White's writings interpret themselves, you're not going to conclude what you're saying. You're interpreting her by other people's writings.
No, I would argue at face value you do have a physical amalgamation in those two passages. What you offer in the other passages about intermarriage, she never uses the word amalgamation, and I would argue it's for that reason, because it's not the same event. Else she could have said
But you're arguing that.
amalgamation 10 times.
She's not saying that. You're saying that. Is what
Okay,
I'm saying.
where
You're
does it-
interpreting that.
And
That-
you're interpreting it otherwise, but I would say that mine is based on the grammatical structure of the sentence. Yours requires two amalgamations, mine doesn't.
Well, if you look
Yours
at this,
requires the assumption that she's using amalgamation as a synonymous for intermarriage.
well,
You assume that.
this is an example of her writing. This is 1863, and so she says here, Christ died for the whole human family, whether white or black. God has made man a free moral agent, whether white or black. So she's clearly putting white and black on the same level. They're part of the human family. The institution of slavery, which clearly Adventists were fighting against, does away with this and permits man to exercise exercise over his fellow man a power which God has never granted him and which belongs alone to God. The slave master has dared assume the responsibility of God over his slave, and accordingly, he will be accountable for the sins, ignorance, and vice of the slave, which is consistent with the other passage that I read to you. So when she says here, he will be called to an account for the power which he exercises over the slave, the colored race are God's property. Their maker alone is their master. And those who have dared chain down the body and the soul of the slave to keep him in degradation like the brutes will have their retribution. So, and this is an example, this is not the only area, but this is an example of her writing where she clearly puts the black and the white race as equal. They're human beings in the sight of God. So if she viewed them as being less than human or something like that, that wouldn't be consistent with a statement like this. And this is 1863.
Even Uriah argues that just because they're mixed with animals, that doesn't make them less human. They can still be human. They can still be saved. That's fine. They can still be Christians. But that doesn't change the argument that they're mixed with animal blood, according to the original statement. They are an amalgamation.
Yeah, but that statement is from 1863. The things we're reading here are from 1864. So if she's holding the view that the black race is just as human as the white race, that the slavery is evil and it shouldn't exist, then how can you argue and say, no, she's saying that they're mixed with animals and this and that? That again, you're not taking into account how she spoke about this topic. She clearly, and I showed you the line of texts from the 1860s all the way to 1890, where she continually says it was the base crime of the amalgamation between the sons of God and the daughters of man.
But she doesn't say amalgamation there. She doesn't.
But I'm saying, you look at the context. The context is the flood, the sin that brought the flood on, whether you're going back to,
it mentions only the people, not the animals.
passage in Third Spiritual Gifts, or whether you're looking at Patriarchs and Prophets, she's clearly dealing with the same thing. And that is what the Bible says throughout, that We're not to be unequally yoked. And that was the problem that Israel had. That was the problem in the days of Ezra.
But that commentary of people mixture only doesn't mention the animals. It's a completely different context. You're trying to splice different talking points of Ellen White about similar story. I agree it's the same story before the flood, the Setite view, whatever you want to say there, but it's still dealing with different issues. It's not the same. You're splicing different places to argue that they are the same.
And what you're doing is and this is what I knew you would do, and I understood it from the beginning. You wouldn't allow Ellen White to say what she meant. You would interpret her through Payne. You would interpret her through Smith, but you can't find anywhere in Ellen White's writings where she says, "I mean what they say." So you're making an assumption. I'm just looking at her writings. There's a stream of passages from the 1860s to 1890, and they're all consistent that the problem was the sons of God intermingling with the daughters of men. Now, you want to say, well, she didn't use amalgamation, so it doesn't mean the same thing. What I'm saying, what matters is the context and not the word. And you're saying unless the word is there, she can't mean the same thing.
No, my point is she can mean the same thing if the context was a little bit different. If she said amalgamation of men and amalgamation of beasts, then I can agree with you. But that's not what she does. The English construction is that I must see one type of amalgamation for the animals and for the humans. You try to say it's two, even though she writes one. How am I supposed to see the endless varieties of species of animals and certain races of men and see spirituality in the men, physicality in the animals?
And I said that there is the physical aspect. Obviously, they had physical offspring. They had the Nephilim. There is physical. There is a physical union, and there are physical aspects. But ultimately, we can't make a one-to-one correspondence because animals are not people. So they're not going to be held accountable for the same things.
But the context of the quote isn't just to see that when humans interbreed between each other, therefore new humans are produced. That's not the point of the quote. The point of the quote is to mention something that is similar in the animals and something that is similar in those races of men. It would be the physical features.
If we look in the Bible alone, we looked at the passages. The issue throughout the Bible is the believer and the unbeliever, and that they shouldn't be unequally yoked. And that's the point that she's also making, and she makes it repeatedly and says that this is the key to consider as to why the flood happened. So you're just saying, well, because it's physical with the animals and it's spiritual with the humans. And I'm trying to say animals are not made in the image of God as humans are. So of course, you got to consider the nature of a human. You're saying we should only consider the physical. Yeah, when we consider the animals, because they're not made in the image of God. The nature of an animal, we don't hold amalgamation. The nature of an animal, the word is used. The word is used, but the word is applied to humans and the word is applied to animals. And what's the importance when it comes to the humans?
If a singular word is used, amalgamation, I must apply it in the same sense. What you're saying that I must apply the word in different senses. That's not what she writes. She writes, there is one amalgamation, one sin and crime of amalgamation, one, not two.
Is that basically your argument? Is that the key argument? Because what you're saying is that if it comes to you, see, your argument is basically based on the idea that she must mean an amalgamation between people and animals. And that's the assumption based on you reading her through these other writings. And I'm saying that's not what she means.
I don't think the other writings.
Your interpretation is confined to this understanding, which is that you're reading her through other people's writings, and I'm allowing, I'm going with Kevin Morgan on that I want, just like with the Bible, we let the Bible interpret itself.
What are the confused species then? What are the confused species that she writes about?
Which ones? The animals that are referred to?
She doesn't specify. According to you, it's only the animals, even though she writes it's both something that the man has to participate in.
Okay, so when she's talking about the animals, these were animals that were a result of breeding and experimentation, and they were wiped out.
But it says the confused species is a result of the amalgamation of men and beasts. So it has to include something in the men. What can it quote in the men? It cannot be morality.
When the sons of God intermingled with the daughters of men, the results was confusion, obvious spiritual confusion, moral confusion, all kinds of confusion. Only. And none of them went onto the ark. The species are referring to the animals. You're saying the species refer to people?
I would say that the species refer to a new breed that is half man, half animal.
No, no.
That's what she means.
That's your assumption
That's
based
why she
on.
says that those species were not made by God.
So when you
That's
you
why she
say
says
what
they
she
died.
means when she says species and the confused species, you're saying that that's some kind of a hybrid. And that's
Yeah,
and
and
that's
that's
the
what
only
people.
thing, and you're saying that's the only thing that that can mean, a hybrid between man and animal.
That's the most natural reading of the quote, and that's what most early Adventists believed, and they argued that
Does it,
people before the flood
brother?
had technology to do that.
Early Adventists believe all kinds of things that are not generally accepted in the church, especially when it comes to the Trinity.
Because you're not consistent. That's my argument. You're not consistent with you're trying to do revision of the historical Adventism.
No, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to read her writings within the context of her writings. You're reading them within the context of other people.
Okay, what is the
You
confusion
can't
in people
find
at the time of seeing the animals?
you can't find anywhere in her writings.
I don't have to need
You can't
other
find
places
her
where she
saying
writes about that.
I endorse this portion. This is what I meant. Uriah Smith said what
She
I meant.
doesn't have. Oh, I don't think that she has to qualify that she specifically endorsed Uriah book, but not this part. She doesn't have to say these things. Just it's problematic enough that she takes this book that is very, very clear what it means, and she sells it to everybody that she meets.
So
I think that is clear enough.
in the 1863 statement that she wrote, that we looked at against slavery, which was before the writings that were in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 3, where she speaks of the white man, the black man, they're both people of God, they're God's property. She puts them on the same level. She speaks against slavery. Are you saying all of that is consistent with someone who would believe that people that the black race is not quite human, that they're mixed with animals?
Yeah, because that's talking about salvation and being a Christian. Being a Christian has nothing to do with your genes, but that doesn't mean that this changes the point that they are mixed with animals. Where does she
Okay.
deny that? Nowhere.
So your view is not the view. I'm an ordained Seventh-day Adventist pastor. Your view is not, you have an interpretation of Ellen White's writings.
Yeah, like all the
Maybe some
pioneers.
people had, the pioneers were
All the
growing.
pioneers.
You're going to say all the pioneers, all of them.
Find me with somebody who disagrees with me for the first 70 years. Prominent one.
What I'm trying to, so your argument, we don't consider all the pioneers to be inspired. We don't view them in that way.
Okay, where did they get
Because
this view?
you're
Where?
making the same kind of argument that an anti-Trinitarian would make. And they will say, look, this pioneer said this pioneer said that, but that is not the view of the church. That's not the official view of the church. So
Well, I care what the prophet says, not the church.
we don't base our doctrines on what pioneers said. We base them ultimately on the Bible, and we do believe that Ellen White's writings are aligned with the Bible, and we take that view. And because of that, that's why Dr. Marsh said that her writings must be aligned with what science shows. And so he assumed that
Yeah,
because of
but
his
that
assumption that
presupposes
she's a
that
prophetess.
you presuppose that she's a prophetess, therefore you bind it to science and the
And you
canon of the
presuppose
Bible.
that she's not. And you presuppose
Yeah,
that she's not.
but the
And so
historical
you
position is on
interpret
my
her
side.
through other people. But you can't possibly make the argument you're making from her writings alone. You have
Yeah,
to
I
use
can. I
it.
think that
You did not.
if you read
You
it,
didn't do it. But you didn't do
okay,
it.
when people didn't consult her, where are they getting their interpretation from? If they just read the meaning just plainly, they read the two statements and they interpret it literally as me. Why are they doing this if that's not what you meant?
That's not my place to understand why people come to
But
conclusions they make. And it's
but
also
you're
not
saying
my
that they
place
are
to make
speculating. They are
assumptions
all.
about what Ellen White made based on conclusions that were popular in her day.
But how come nobody
If you
interprets
look
it
at
like
her
you? That's my point.
in her day, for example, when it comes to the Trinity, there was a lot of misunderstanding poured into those words, into the Trinity, into the word the Trinity. There was a lot of misunderstanding. So she didn't use the word Trinity, but over time she explained the doctrine of the Trinity. So she didn't use the word, but she explained the doctrine. She spoke about the heavenly trio, the three holiest beings, the three great worthies. So over time, she unfolded the theology, but she didn't use the word Trinity because there was a lot of misunderstanding poured into the word. When it comes to amalgamation, there was a lot of misunderstanding poured into that word. So as she expanded on the doctrine, on this teaching about what happened and what caused the flood, she didn't use the word amalgamation in her later writings, but she expanded on the doctrine. In other words, she expanded on what the Bible points to, which is what we see in chapter
Yeah,
6
two
of
different
Genesis.
stories. She's arguing one of the stories is yours of the intermarriage, everything that you read there, and the other story is the amalgamation of man and beast, which is what we are arguing right now. They're not the same story. You assume it's the same
It
story.
is the same story. It's the same context. It's dealing with the flood. It's dealing with what caused the flood. The only thing that you're
Yeah, two
hooking
different
onto
events,
is
yeah.
that she used amalgamation here and she didn't use it there, and you're throwing out the whole context.
No, I'm not. I would argue that from the basic quote, it says that we are to see something when we see the certain races of men and the animals. That is very clear. You cannot put moral amalgamation there. It's not possible based on the context. Okay, you can read. You read for me the original quote. Tell me how you interpret it. Since the flood, there has been
We've
amalgamation.
went over the quote plenty of times.
Yeah, and I didn't hear what kind of confusion am I to see in the certain races of
There
men
was
I also see in the humans. What is it?
Look, let's
Unless
go back.
It's physical, what is it?
Let's
It
go
cannot be
back.
spiritual.
No, we'll go back. You want to let's go
Okay.
back to it again. And I think after this, I'm gonna, we'll say, goodbye for now. But let me go back to that.
That's fine. Okay.
Because we've gone on here pretty long here, and I
Yeah, this
appreciate. I
one,
just
yeah,
want to
just
say I do appreciate the discussion. I
fine,
appreciate
yeah,
it,
me too. Yeah.
and I think I gave you time, right? I gave you time, uninterrupted time.
Yeah,
I
I think
heard
that
you out.
you did decently, yeah. That's fine.
Okay, so when we look at these are the two passages. So what do you want to look at now?
I want you to comment on the second passage. How are we to understand it?
This one?
The second, yeah.
Okay. So she says here, every species of animal which God had created were preserved in the ark. So on the ark, as we see in the Bible, God had called 7 pairs of the clean, a pair of the unclean. But these were representatives of the original animal kinds as God created them. These were representatives of the original animal kinds he had created. But when it says the confused species, these are the animals that were the result of the experimentation and the breeding and the selective breeding that was being done for ultimately sinful purposes by man.
So would you
Okay.
say that so far she's talking about the physical amalgamation between animals and animals?
Yeah, but brother, we went over that already.
Just say yes or no. I mean, is that
Here we're talking about the amalgamation of animals. So yeah, it's a physical.
yeah,
That is
amalgamation.
physical.
Okay, yeah, I'm going with your presupposition. Let's say that I agree with you. So she here in the second sentence, she's talking about the confused species, which were the result between the mixture of animals and
Yeah.
animals.
Yeah,
Right?
that's what she's saying. These are animals. These
Yeah,
are
which
not.
is physical, which is a physical problem.
You're
Physical
saying that
amalgamation.
you're saying that these confused species include people that are the result of sexual union between man and animals. That's what you're including in that species.
Yeah, I do, but let's say that I stick with your interpretation.
Okay,
That's
yeah,
fine.
yeah, okay, that's what I'm saying. I
And
mean,
you're saying that this
do you ever
amalgamation,
have any passages in Ellen White's writings where she speaks of people as different species of people?
I don't know, maybe not.
Okay.
So you agree here that it's about a physical amalgamation, not spiritual, right? In the second sentence.
Yeah, that's physical. That's talking about the animals.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, confused species which God did not create, which were the result of amalgamation, were destroyed by the flood. Yeah.
Okay. And then she continues, since the flood, there has been amalgamation of man and beast. I would say the same one, physical one, as may be seen in almost endless varieties of species of animal, that is still the physical one, and in certain races of men, again the physical one.
Okay,
she's speaking about the same thing.
I said before, obviously, when the sons of God intermingled with the daughters of men, there was a physical union that resulted in physical offspring, but ultimately it's the spiritual aspect. It was the physical aspect.
Okay,
when you have
I understand, yeah, but The
A
point is this.
person from Nigeria marry a person from Ireland, the kids are going to show physical features of that union, of that amalgamation, so to speak.
But why am I?
People have been, when you have someone from the Philippines marry someone from Italy, when you have someone from Puerto Rico marry someone from China, there's going to be a physical aspect. But ultimately, the Bible is consistent that the key issue is the godly and the ungodly when it comes to the people. When it
That's
comes to
fine,
the,
but let's stick to the text. Yeah, I understand. The problem is this: is it sinful to physically mix people?
it's sinful to have a marriage that is contrary to the will of God, which is what was going on there. The
So
Bible is
the
clear.
answer is no,
If
right?
I
The answer is no.
The answer is, what do you mean no? I mean, if I say, look, if I do what Samson did, if I do what Solomon did, if I do what the
Yeah, that's for
Israelites,
moral
if I
reasons. It's
do
not the same example.
what the Jewish nation did in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, that was a sin. They married the pagan women because they were not driven by anything you do that is not driven by a godly motive. If I say, look, if I'm driven by a godly motive, wouldn't I
I
want to marry
understand the point.
would
Yeah,
you
I
want to marry
understand
a
it.
godly wife? Would you want to do that?
You're getting beyond the verse and beyond my point that I'm
No,
trying to
but
convey.
I'm going with what the Bible says. And I understand what she's saying to be in line with what the Bible says. You
But
don't
you admitted
understand
that,
it that way.
okay, you admitted that when it comes to the endless varieties of species of animals, that's physical. You also agree that in the certain races of men, that's physical also. The problem is this: she's citing the varieties of species that are physical as something negative, which means that the rest part in certain races of men, that is also evidence of negative amalgamation,
But
which
but
you
the
agreed is physical.
commonality between those two things, even though
Yeah,
the
it's
result
physical.
is not the same. The result the result is not the same. But the
It is the same.
commonality, no, hold on. Let me finish. The commonality between those two things is that both of those things were what were caused by man. It was man's choice to start amalgamating those animals, and it was man's choice to have the interaction with the daughters of man. So they both were the result of man's choice. And that's the
That's
commonality
fine, but
between both of
that's not
those
the point that I'm trying
amalgamations.
to make. My
You
point
want to
is,
make a you want to draw a line of commonality that suits your argument, which is based on assuming that she must mean the same thing as these other people. But I'm saying if we look at this biblically, ultimately it's man's responsibility. It was the result of man's choice to amalgamate those
everything is the
animals.
result of main choice. That's not the
Yeah,
point. The
that is the
point is,
point.
what
Well,
is the effect of
that's the key point. That's the main point. Man was the one that sinned. The animals didn't sin. The
you
animals
don't
brought
seem to allow the
the
text to speak for
amalgamation of the
itself here.
animals. The amalgamation of the animals was brought out by the idea by the work of man. The amalgamation among the people was the work of man. Now you might say, well, we see physical results here, we don't see physical results there, and I'm saying because human beings by nature are not purely physical alone.
That's not the
God,
point.
we were made in
You're
the
going
image of
beyond the
God.
point.
No,
Yeah. So
I'm going beyond I'm going beyond what you're saying.
I just want to read the verses and stick to the way that the verses are written. You seem to neglect the narrative that is in the contextual sentence that she writes it, and you want to presuppose every other thing that she wrote.
Well,
Let's just read the quote
I
for what
think
it says.
when I make my argument, I can make my argument by going to her writings and the Bible. But you make your argument by going to other people's ideas
I can
outside of
stick
them.
with that quote alone. I don't need the historical argument. All I have to say is that if I am to see the certain races of men, which is physical feature there, and the certain animals, which is physical feature there, then the question is, how is it negative for the animals, but neutral or good for the humans?
All right, my brother. Well, I think I've answered that question in
It must be
various
negative in
ways.
both cases. That's the point. But the Bible says that it's not evil to mix people.
The negativity was man's sinful drive and man's sinful desire
But
in
she's
both
talking about the
cases.
physical features.
I'm answering the
Oh, God.
question. Ultimately, the negativity is because of man's sinful, rebellious desire in both cases. Whether man interacting with man, having unholy marriages, or people with people, or when it comes to the amalgamation of the animals. In both cases, it was man's sinful desires.
But that's not what she's talking. She's talking only about physical features, and she's saying that it's wrong to see those features in these people. It's negative.
Where
But
does she
we know
say that? Where
biblically
does
that
she say the problem was their physical features? That was the problem. Where does she say that physical features was
when
the
it says
problem?
that the amalgamation was the base crime, which is a crime, and the effect is certain races of men and certain animals. If it was a problem back then, it's a problem after the flood, and the effect of that is certain confused species, which later diversified to be certain animals and certain races of men. It's still
But where
negative,
did
still confusion.
but where does she say, brother, that it's the focus is the physical features? That's the key focus that she has there.
Because it's contrasting the physicality of the animals with the certain races of men. They
And
are
I'm trying to tell you,
identical.
animals and people are not the same. The focus is obviously there's going to be different. There's going to be a different focus.
But
But
she's
the
saying that the evidence of this amalgamation is something that you can see in both the race, both the species, in the humans and in the animals. What is the commonality
we
there?
do. The commonality is ultimately
Is the
drawn
physical
out of
features.
the result of what man did.
Oh
It's
man.
the man did these things. He intermingled those animals. He interbred them, and the confused species didn't enter the ark, and the confused people didn't enter the ark either. But she doesn't. She's not referring to people when she says
But a
species.
new breed of animals has nothing to do with moral confusions in the humans.
As a result, the Bible shows, we look at Genesis chapter 6, as a result
Yeah,
of
one leads to the other, but
the intermarrying of those two groups resulted in the Nephilim. So that was what came out. That was the
she
group that
said,
came out.
okay,
The Nephilim
the
came out.
problem, I understand the problem with this argument is this. She's saying that in the 19th century, I'm supposed to look at her time. In her time, when I see a new breed of animal, I'm supposed to see some confusion that is also true for some people from the 19th century.
She didn't, again, when she's talking about the base crime that brought about the flood, she's speaking about the intermingling and the amalgamation that brought about the flood, or that was if she, remember, she uses the word
But she
if
speaks
it
since
could
the
be
flood,
said. It doesn't mean that
after the flood.
after the flood, she doesn't speak of it in the same sense. She's saying that there
It is the
was,
same sense.
no, she's saying
Does she say that since the
there
flood,
was
she says
well,
that,
okay. If you're going to
oh man.
say she's saying all amalgamation after the flood was sinful, are you saying she's saying all amalgamation after the flood was sinful?
Yeah. She's first describing the sin before the flood, then she says the same thing happens after the flood.
Well, we can see examples of sinful amalgamation after the flood. We can definitely see that. We could still see the same
Yeah, but she
problem
says
of the
that I'm
godly and
supposed
the
to look.
ungodly. We could see the godly and the ungodly intermingling. We could see
Okay, but which
other
races is
kinds
she
of
referring to?
amalgamation, bestiality. We could see
I agree
the
with you. That's not the
Ammonites
point.
and
We
the
agree there.
Moabites coming out of
We
an
agree there.
incestuous
But she's
union.
saying the problem is that she's saying that when I see some confused animals after the flood, I'm supposed to notice their confusion and see some races of men that have the same confusion. Do you understand that point?
Are there some races of people, are there some people groups that are pagan?
Yeah,
Okay. Would you say paganism is confusion or not?
it is spiritual confusion, yeah,
Yeah. So
but
in the
nothing to do with the
Bible, what
animals.
is the focus? When the Bible says that the Israelites are not to intermarry with all these other people, was the focus the physical or was the focus the spiritual?
The spiritual, but it's commenting only on the people. That is the difference, not the animals. She's saying I must see the animals and the people, both at the same time.
And what I'm saying is animals are not morally accountable.
Yeah, which means that she means I must see the physicality in the animals and compare it to certain races that bear the same physicality.
And that's where you're making the assumption. But that
I'm not
assumption
making an
is not
assumption. That's what the
based.
text says.
Well, I showed you her texts, and her texts throughout over a period of time, and we see a consistency there that doesn't fit with this interpretation of
Okay,
yours.
how is
You would admit that, right?
she
She did
how is she
not.
supposed to say it
Why
then?
would
How is
she?
she supposed to say it?
Well, let me ask you something. If you want to make that argument, and you're saying that she did agree that the black people were the result of this amalgamation and the other races were the result of it, why, when this controversy was going on, why didn't she make that very clear over time? Why didn't she make that point over time?
Which point?
The point that there are certain people that are the result of breeding between people and animals in certain races.
I think that Uriah made it for her, and I think that the
No.
original quote says it. She
Well,
says
why
certain
didn't she,
races of
though? What
men.
I'm asking is, why didn't she?
Why does she have to qualify it further? She says certain races of
Okay,
men.
so I'm
Thomas,
saying,
why
why does
cannot
she
you say
have
all
to?
races of men?
So again, so when it comes to her specifying the point, you're saying, well, why does she have to do that? But what I'm saying is, why did she have, when it comes to Uriah Smith, you're
Mhm.
assuming that she must have meant what he meant when she didn't say that.
But well, I'm making a good argument because she sold his work, 2,000 copies,
And I'm
where
saying
it
that
says
the
that.
point of the overall point of the work was a defense of her ministry. It wasn't
Yeah,
it
and
wasn't an
against the
endorsement
claim
of
that she's a
everything
racist.
he
Yeah,
wrote. She didn't agree with everything he wrote.
sure, that's fine, but I would say that this is a pretty serious charge. She knew that the critics were already accusing her of this. She knew all the charges. Uriah defended her. Oh, you're saying she wasn't aware. She didn't agree with him. Yeah, it's. I think that if you're consistent with how English works, I don't speak English very well, but I would say that the sentence, since the flood there has been amalgamation, after the flood, which may be seen when, in the 19th century, during her days, in certain races of men, without specification who, she doesn't say all races, she says some races of men, and certain animal species of her days. So when she's saying a crossbreed species, she must know the same amalgamation there as in the people of those days, not in the past.
So
So
when
she's not talking about the, yeah?
there have been mixes. Obviously, there's been mixing between different racial groups of people, but it's
Which
not
is not sinful.
but it's not
Yeah, but then the
sinful.
Bible says that this is not sinful,
No,
which
that's what I'm
means that
saying.
your
And
interpretation cannot be true.
no, you're making an assumption because the amalgamation after the flood is not necessarily being said to always be sinful. There was sinful because we do have, well, I'm just considering what's written there. There has been an amalgamation since the flood. Is she saying that the interbreeding or the selective breeding that resulted in various types of horses and cows and cats and dogs and goldfish and pigeons, that all of that is sinful? Is she saying that? No, she's not saying that. But has there been amalgamation that has been sinful? Well, we see it right in the Bible. We see
Okay, then
amalgamation since the flood that has been sinful. We see what resulted in the Moabites,
what?
the Ammonites. We see amalgamation in terms of the Samaritans, how they came about,
Okay,
and
when is it sinful to mix animals, and when is it not sinful?
what was driving. The Bible says the earth was confused and full of violence, and that every inclination of the thoughts of men's heart evil continually in Genesis 6:5. So they had evil intentions in bringing about the amalgamation of animals. Maybe they were breeding these animals for dog fights. I'm just ballparking right now.
Yeah, but that's
Maybe
not
they
what he
were
said.
breeding animals for perverse sexual purposes or some
But
other
then
thing,
the
or to defy God, or to use in some practices. I don't know. But the Bible is clear that the earth was corrupt and full of violence. So there was a corrupt motive. The Bible says God weighs the motives of the heart. So there
but
was
if
a
you're
corrupt
consistent, you
motive.
must agree that she said that all these animal species, they're confused species, even though I don't agree with you. If I presuppose your view, if those confused species are only animals, she literally says God did not make them, God destroyed them with a flood. So you cannot have a historical case where creating new animal species is fine. It's never fine. It's always a sin.
But when it comes to human activity in bringing about an animal quote unquote species, that aligns with what we would say are breeds. So she was using that term, and it seems arguable from her writings. The way that she was using that term was aligned with the way that the term was used in the 19th century. So
But
you
animals
do
that
have
can breed,
some. There are some there are cases in the world today where there are new species of animals that are the result of the intermingling of species of animals that happen naturally among the animals, but it's not the
but that's
common.
fine.
It's
That
definitely
is still
not
created
common.
by God. But that is still natural design. She says the confused species were not created by God. If you find a tiger and a lion to create a liger, that is still permissible because that is possible. That is something that God, by
Yeah,
biology, has
that's
ordained.
because, yeah, but before the flood, the drive of when the Bible says every inclination of the thoughts of men's hearts evil continually, the earth was corrupt and filled with violence. There was a motive behind the amalgamation that happened then. That's what's
Yeah,
being
because they're
focused
mixing
on.
things that cannot be mixed. That is the point. That's why it's confused. But that's why it's not made by God, because it cannot be mixed naturally. That's not the breeding process
Well,
that
if
you're
it couldn't be
describing.
mixed, if it couldn't be you obviously if they could have offspring, there was there was the ability to mix them, but it was man that was directing that and with problematic nefarious purposes.
That's if you presuppose your interpretation. I don't, but I'm just telling you that according to your interpretation, you have to argue that amalgamation is sometimes okay, which is not what she's talking about. Literally, your interpretation creates more problems than it solves.
Well, if you speak of amalgamation, and again, she's using a word, and it was used, as we saw in the various texts, in ways that did refer to people intermarrying with other people. And so if you're
Yeah, when it
using
mentions
that
holy
word,
people.
if you're gonna hook onto that word, then when it comes to different racial groups, so to speak, because ultimately I believe there's only one race, but for the sake of argument, different people groups, you can speak of amalgamation in that way. That's not sinful.
Yeah, because it's only mentioning people. To mix people is never sinful. That's fine. It's only problem if you deal with morals. Yes, then it can become sinful. But by design, by biology, it's never evil to mix different races. That is fine. Moses took an Ethiopian woman. He didn't commit the sin of amalgamation. It wasn't a problem.
No, I know, I know. Anyway, brother, I gotta let you go. I appreciate it, though.
Yeah, we can schedule another for other topics if you want. I'm open.
Okay, so like I said, I mean, I feel that we would both agree that I gave you time to present.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Did I give you a fair opportunity?
Absolutely. I don't have the problems that I had with ADL and Kevin Morgan in a minor status. You were fine. Yeah, you were great. You gave me the time to present my view, and I don't think that I missed anything.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that it was fair, and I appreciate the discussion, and I consider you a brother in Christ. I consider you, you're seeking the Lord. You want to be faithful to his word. And even though we have this disagreement concerning Ellen White, I would say that we're both trying to uphold the truth. That's what we have a disagreement, but we're both seeking to uphold the truth.
Yeah, could agree with what you said. Yeah.
All right, brother. Well, God bless you, and maybe we'll talk again. We'll see.
Yeah, you can email me if you want another topic.
Okay, my friend. Take
Bye,
care.
man. Thank you.